Blood and Fog. Chapter 9. Threshold. The first thing she needed was a table, not immediately. The first thing she actually needed was wood for the fire, and Devon had brought that the same afternoon she asked, stacking it against the outside wall with the economical care of someone who has done this kind of work their whole life. He had not come in. He had set the wood down, looked at the stack once to confirm it was sound, and walked back into the trees. No ceremony, no waiting to be thanked. She had stood in the doorway watching him go. 20 years of reading other people's behavior for political signal told her this was not indifference. This was the opposite of indifference. This was a man who had learned, somewhere in the process of running a pack from the age of 23, that the most respectful thing you could offer a person was space that did not require filling. She lit the fire. The flue drew cleanly. The room was hers. The table came from the forest. Elian appeared on the third morning with a plank across his shoulders, moving through the bracken with the uncomplaining forward momentum of someone who has decided a thing and is now executing it. He had the feather box in one hand and the plank across both shoulders, carrying both with the unbothered competence of a kid raised by wolves who never separated a child's job from an adult's. "It was in the storage shed," he said, setting it down against the outside wall with a sound like a minor collapse. "The shed is for pack stores, but this plank was just leaning there. It wasn't doing anything." He looked at her. "Davin said I could." "Did he?" "He said I could bring things from the stores that weren't needed." "What did he actually say?" A pause. He said, "Don't take anything the pack is using." Elian looked at the plank, which this wasn't. So, she looked at it. It was rough cut, too wide for one person to carry comfortably, and one end had warped enough to explain why it had been left against the storage shed instead of put to use. It would make a reasonable table surface if she found something to support it at the right height. "Help me find 2 stones," she said. "Even ones." His face rearranged itself into the expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when he had correctly predicted something and was exercising restraint about it. He went looking without another word. He came back with 2 stones the size of loaves, one under each arm, walking like the weight was an opinion he'd decided to ignore. She set them at the width of her own shoulders and had him lay the plank across. It rocked. The warped end sat a finger's width higher than the other, and when she pressed down on it, the whole surface complained, a low groan of wood settling against stone. "It's not level," Elian said, like she might not have noticed. "No. You could plane it." "I don't have a plane." He considered this with the seriousness of someone solving an actual engineering problem, then went out again and came back with 3 flat shards of slate, stacking them under the low stone until the surface held steady when she pushed. She tested it with both palms flat, rocking her weight forward. Nothing moved. She thought about the joiners in Seraphine's employ, the ones who came twice a year to true the doors and the window frames until every seam in the Coven house closed without a draft. This table would never close like that. The plank would always carry its warp, a visible fact instead of a corrected one, and she found she did not want to plane it. She wanted the thing that was actually there. "Leave the warp," she said, when Elian asked again, on the second day, whether she wanted him to find a straighter piece. He looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at birds he hadn't identified yet, then shrugged and went back to sorting feathers, and the table kept its crooked edge, and she never mentioned it again. The stool took less thought. Elian dragged a section of log from firewood he swore was extra. She did not ask what extra meant in a pack stockpile. and stood it on end, and it was the right height without adjustment, which felt like luck until she understood he'd measured it against his own hip on the walk over, the way he measured everything, without appearing to. The shelf was hers alone. She wedged a spike into the mortar between two stones in the wall, angled it downward the way she remembered a groom doing once with a horseshoe nail, and drove it home with the flat of a rock instead of a hammer, 3 strikes, tight and unhurried until it held her whole weight hanging from it. She did not tell Seraphine's masons this was how she'd learned to build. She was not sure they would have believed her, and she found, testing the shelf a second time with both books stacked on it, that she did not care. By the end of the first week, the room held all 3, and the fire drew without smoking. The single window let in enough light during the middle hours of the day to read by, and she had 3 books, the only things she had brought from Seraphine's domain, retrieved in 2 careful trips through the town at hours when she was unlikely to encounter anyone who would report back. She did not go far into the town. She went in the early mornings, before the fog lifted enough to make anyone visible at a distance, and she moved quickly and without pausing to look at things. The town felt different now. It had always been Seraphine's space. The amber-lit windows, the streets arranged according to a century-old logic that suited vampires who moved without noise. Walking through it now felt like reading a document she had once believed was about her, and discovering it had never been about her at all. The town had been arranged for Seraphine's comfort and Seraphine's politics, and the safe management of things Seraphine considered hers. Mara had simply been one of those things. She did not feel grief about it. She noted the absence of grief the way she noted other data points. It told her something about where she was now and where she had been. Elian came every morning. He did not ask permission and she did not offer it, and after the 3rd day it had stopped being something either of them thought about. He arrived at roughly the same hour, the feather box under his arm and usually something else in his other hand, a tool borrowed from pack stores, a length of rope, once a ceramic bowl he said was spare, and which was not chipped, which meant it was not spare, but which she accepted without comment. He left before midday. He came back after what she estimated was the main pack meal, and he stayed until the light dropped, at which point he went back into the forest, with the same unceremonious departure that Devon used. She noticed that he always looked back once, from the tree line. She did not comment on this either. What he brought, beyond the physical objects, was information. Not political intelligence. Elian had no interest in politics and limited patience for anyone who did. What he brought was the texture of the pack's daily life, delivered in the associative rapid-fire monologue that was his natural register. Who was fighting with whom about the border patrol schedule? Whether the old she-wolf Talassa was going to let the healer look at her shoulder or keep insisting it was fine when it was clearly not fine. An ongoing and increasingly bitter disagreement between 2 pack members about whether the Eastern Trail markers needed replacing or just reinforcing. A hawk that had taken up hunting the rabbit warren behind the storage sheds, and which Elian had spent 2 full mornings trying to identify by wing shape alone before giving up and asking Sable, who told him without looking up from her mending that it was a red tail and always had been. He recited the pack's small disasters and small triumphs with the same even attention. No detail more important than any other, and woven through all of it, without appearing to notice he was offering them, were observations about Devon. Devon had been up before the rest of the pack for the last 4 mornings. Devon had sent 2 of the older wolves to check a section of the southern border that had not been checked in 3 months. Devon had sat through the evening fire without carving, which Elian noted was unusual and did not elaborate on. And Devon had asked Elian, twice now, whether Mara had said anything about staying through winter. A question Elian reported with the flat innocence of someone who had not noticed. It was a question with weight on it. Mara listened to all of it and said little, and remembered everything. On the 6th day, she went back into the forest. Not toward the linden stand, toward the edge, the 100 meters of mixed birch and old oak that separated the river's east bank from the deeper forest. She walked it in the afternoon, when the light came in sideways and the ground under the leaf mulch was cold but not frozen. She was looking at the tree line, at the way the forest opened and closed depending on where you stood, at the sight lines. The bridge keeper's house sat at a crossing. Not just the river crossing, but the crossing of two different kinds of attention. From the house's river window, you could see the collapsed bridge gap and the town's fog beyond it. From the forest-facing door, you could see the tree line and whoever came out of it. Nothing approached the house from either direction without passing through the house's field of view first. She had not chosen it for that, but she stood in the afternoon light looking at the geometry of the position, and understood why someone had built a house here, at this exact spot, generations before the territorial arrangement had its current shape. Whoever had been the bridge keeper had understood something about living at a seam. She was still standing there, tracing the sight lines with her eyes when she found him. He was 30 meters off, at the place where the birches gave way to darker growth, and he was not moving. Corvin stood with his weight settled evenly on both feet, the stillness of a man who had already been standing there before she turned and intended to go on standing there regardless of what she did next. His left hand hung slightly open at his side, the same stiffness she remembered from the boundary stone, and his bronze eyes held on her, unhurried, missing the urgency a stranger's attention usually carried. She did not startle. She had spent 20 years in rooms where showing surprise cost more than feeling it, and the habit had not left her because the room was now a forest. Neither of them moved for the length of 3 breaths. She thought about walking toward him. She thought about the version of herself that would have Seraphine's ward, trained to close distance and manage a difficult presence with warmth before it could curdle into something worse. That version knew how to do this. It knew how to make itself agreeable, how to fold a stranger's suspicion into something softer before it could set. She stayed where she was. If he wanted a conversation, he would come to the house the way Devon had. He had not come to the house. He had come to the tree line and stopped at exactly the distance that let him watch and commit to nothing a watch like that might turn into. And she understood, the way she understood most things about this pack now, that the distance itself was the message. She held his gaze and offered nothing else, no nod, no raised hand, nothing that could be read as an invitation or a plea. 2 people, cataloging each other across 30 meters of cold ground, both of them fluent in the same exacting silence. He looked away first, not down, not aside. He simply turned his head toward the deeper forest, the way a man turns from a ledger he has finished reading for the day. Then he went still in a different way. It lasted less than a second. His head stopped its turn a fraction early, angled toward a point in the deeper trees she couldn't have marked afterward if her life had required it, and his expression changed in a way that had nothing to do with her. Not the flat, cataloging attention he'd been giving her for 3 breaths, but a narrower thing, quicker. The look of a man doing rapid arithmetic on a variable he had not accounted for. She heard nothing. She saw nothing change in the trees themselves. But every bird that had been calling somewhere in the canopy above them stopped at once, mid-phrase, and did not start again. Corvin's hand, the left one, the stiff one, closed most of the way. Then it was gone. His face resumed its usual unhurried composure so completely that she would have doubted what she'd seen, except that she had spent 20 years being trained to notice exactly this kind of half-second, and the training did not lie to her twice in the same afternoon. He walked back into the trees, making no sound she could hear. He did not look back. She had already learned, from Devon and from Elian both, that a clean departure meant something in this pack, and she filed the fact that Corvin's departure had been just as clean, and wondered what that meant coming from a man who had every reason to make his displeasure visible, and wondered, underneath that, what exactly he had heard or felt or expected in the half-second before he'd remembered she was watching him. The birds did not start again for a long time. She stood at the tree line a while longer after he had gone, running the sight lines again with a fact she had not had 10 minutes before. Someone besides Devon and Elian knew exactly where to find her and had chosen, for now, only to look. And underneath that fact, a second one, smaller and colder. Whatever Corvin had been watching for at that tree line, it was not only her. She was sitting at the table with one of the books open and the fire low when Devon came that evening. Not Elian's time. Later, the full, dark well established, the river audible through the window. He knocked. She had not expected that. "Come in." He came in slowly, the way he entered any space he was not sure of, hands visible, taking up less room than he actually occupied. His attention went to the table, the shelf, the stool, the fire, in order, and his face registered all of it without commenting. "You've been busy." "Elian has been busy." She closed the book. "I've been directing." Something moved in his expression that was not quite amusement. He leaned against the wall beside the door, his arms loose at his sides, and settled the amber attention on her that she had stopped trying to deflect. "Corvin wants to know your intentions," he said. "I know." "He hasn't asked you directly." She thought of the tree line that afternoon, of 30 meters and 3 held breaths, and a hand that would not close all the way. "He will." She watched the fire instead of him. What does he actually want to know? Devon was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. Outside, the river moved over its stones, in the particular low register it held after dark. "Whether you're a variable or a constant." He said it without inflection, which meant it was a direct answer rather than a diplomatic one. The pack can work with a constant. Variables require management. "And which am I?" His eyes held on her. The amber was steady, reading. "You're here?" he said. "You came back. You built a table." A pause. "Corvin will call that a constant." "He won't say so." Something in her went sharp before she decided to let it. "You're doing it too," she said. "Just more quietly than Corvin, weighing me, deciding what column I belong in." She kept her voice level, which took more effort than it should have. "I built a table because I wanted a table, not to pass an audit." Whatever came over his face in that moment wasn't the managed stillness she'd learned to read as composure. It was something rawer for once, the look of a man actually caught. "That's fair," he said. He didn't soften it or argue it away, which surprised her more than if he had. "I'm not asking to reassure Corvin. I'm asking because I want to know how to think about you, and I don't have a category that fits, and not having one is uncomfortable in a way I haven't examined closely." A pause. "That's not the same as auditing you. But I understand why it would feel like it from where you're standing." "It does." "I know. Now." He said it plainly, without performance, and she understood this cost him something to admit. She thought about the man who had stood at the tree line in the early morning and pointed her toward this house, and what it had cost him to do it, and what he expected in return for the cost. She thought about a second man, 30 meters into the birches only hours ago, who had not asked for anything at all. "I have no intentions toward the pack," she said. "I have intentions toward this house. They're not the same thing." No. He didn't perform the agreement. He simply confirmed she was right, the same unhurried economy he brought to everything. I'll tell him that. He won't like it. He'll respect it. Devon pushed off the wall. His gaze moved around the room once more, not assessing it, just receiving it, the way he received most things that were new and not yet categorized. The south-facing wall holds heat better. If you move the shelf there and put your books on the north side, the damp won't get into the bindings. She looked at the shelf. At the north wall it was on. At the south wall he had indicated. "I'll move it tomorrow," she said. He didn't move toward the door right away. He stood there a moment longer than the conversation required, close enough that she was aware of exactly how close, and something passed between them that neither of them named. Not the amber attention he used for reading a room, but something with no diplomatic function at all. And it went on a beat past the point where either of them could have called it accidental. He looked away first this time, not her. "Good night," he said, and it came out rougher than anything else he'd said all evening. He nodded once. He went out. She heard his boots on the stone path along the river's edge, and then the forest received him, and the night closed around the house the way it closed around everything at the boundary, without preference, without insistence, simply present on all sides. She stood at the table a moment longer than she needed to, her pulse doing something she didn't examine too closely. Before she made herself sit back down, she opened the book again. She did not, for some time, read a single word of it. Outside, something moved in the upper branches of the nearest birch. A bird, settling for the night, adjusting its weight from one foot to the other. It made a single sound, not song, just the confirmation of presence, and then went quiet. She read until the fire needed tending. On the 8th morning, Elian arrived with the feather box and, tucked under the same arm, a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table with the box on top of it, in the manner of someone who has been asked to deliver something and is doing so without editorial comment. Then he sat on the stool and opened the feather box and began a systematic review of the contents that had no apparent purpose, except to give her time to look at the paper without him watching. She unfolded it. A map. Hand-drawn, ink on paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases had begun to separate the fibers. The east bank of the river, detailed from the collapsed bridge to a point several hundred meters upstream, with the forest's edge marked along the right side and the town's outer buildings sketched faintly on the left. The bridge keeper's house was indicated by a small square with a dot at its center. Around the house, in a careful hand, were annotations. The sight lines she had walked 2 days before, measured and noted. The 2 paths into the forest, marked with approximate distances. The locations of 3 border markers she had not yet found. A note in the bottom corner, 4 words, in the same hand as the annotations. "The roof needs checking." She looked at Elian. He was deeply absorbed in a comparison of 2 feathers that required both hands and full attention. "Who drew this?" "Devon?" He did not look up. "He said the east gable had some new damage from autumn weather and you should know before the cold got worse." He turned the feather slightly. "Also, he said the map was just useful information and not a claim on anything. He said that specifically, that it was useful information." She looked at the map again, at the annotation of the sight lines she had walked, which meant he had either watched her walk them or had understood from the geometry of her position where she would go. At the 4 words in the corner, which were practical and nothing else, and which she read 3 times. She looked around the room for something to fix it with. Elian didn't wait to be asked. He didn't look up from his feathers either. He produced a small iron nail from somewhere inside the feather box, held it out between two fingers, and went back to his comparison. She took it. She drove the nail into the mortar joint above the table on the north wall. Not the wall the shelf would move to whenever she got around to moving it, but the wall she could see from the chair, from the door, from the bed. She hung the map from it by the fold at the top edge, and it settled flat against the stone, the 4 words in the corner facing out into the room, instead of folded away inside it. "Tell him I'll check the gable," she said. Elian nodded once, with the gravity he reserved for messages that mattered. He went back to the feathers. Outside, the fog moved across the river in its usual slow shapes, and the town was somewhere behind it, and the forest was somewhere ahead of it, and the house sat in the seam between them, and the fire held its heat against the cold of the morning, and nothing. Blood and Fog. Chapter 10. The Weight of Still Water. The east gable had a crack in the mortar where the new timber met the old stone, thin enough to pass a finger into and deep enough to let in weather. She found it on a Tuesday morning, standing on a section of the old bridge abutment she had dragged against the wall as a step, running her hand along the joint until the cold came through the gap. She came down and stood back and looked at it. The crack ran for about 1/2 meter, starting where the beam seated into the stonework and following the mortar joint down toward the roof line. It was not new damage. The mortar at the edges of the gap had dried and crumbled in a way that took time. What was new was the separation, the beam pulling slightly from the stone as the wood contracted in the cold, widening something that had been a hairline into something that now admitted weather. She needed lime mortar, and she did not have any, and she did not know, yet, where to get it. She pressed 2 fingers against the gap and felt the draft on the other side of it, thin and cold, a current finding its way through a fault line that hadn't existed when the beam was first set. Water would follow the same path before the frost did. Frost would follow the water. She had learned enough about houses in the last 3 weeks to know that a crack this size, left through a full winter, stopped being a repair and became a project. She was still looking at the crack when Devon came out of the tree line. Not a scheduled visit. She had not known he was coming, and from the way he moved across the ground between the trees and the house, he had not planned to arrive at exactly this moment. He was carrying something wrapped in cloth, and his attention was on the path rather than on her, and she had the rare opportunity to watch him approach without him knowing she was watching. He moved differently when he was not being watched, not relaxed exactly. She was not certain he had a relaxed setting, but the managed quality of him was reduced. The careful economy of his movement was still there, but underneath it was something less deliberate. He walked like the ground was familiar, like the house had already been a feature of his daily route long before she had moved into it. She had noticed this before in small ways. The path from the tree line to the house door was not trampled down randomly. It was worn in a specific line, too defined for the traffic of the past 8 days. He had been coming this way before she arrived. He looked up. He did not change pace or shift his expression when he saw her standing on the abutment section looking at the gable. He simply registered her and continued his approach and stopped at the base of the wall below the crack. "It opened up?" "Yes." She stepped down. "I need lime mortar. I don't know where to source it." "I do." He set down the cloth wrap thing. It had the angular shape of something made of wood, and when he unrolled the cloth it was a mallet and a set of chisels. Old tools, the handles worn to the specific smoothness of long use. "You'll need to rake the old mortar out first. Clean joint. Otherwise the new material won't key in properly." She looked at the tools, at him. You know how to repoint stonework? The pack's buildings are old. He picked up one of the chisels and turned it in his hand, checking the edge. Nobody else was going to learn. She thought of Seraphine's domain, the masons she sent for, the tradespeople who arrived and worked and departed without ever understanding what they had been working on. The careful distance Seraphine kept between the coven's needs and the people she could not afford to let know they existed. Devon's pack did not have that luxury, or did not use it. They maintained their own buildings with their own hands, and they learned what they needed to know. She picked up the smaller chisel. Show me where to start. They worked through the morning. The raking took longer than she expected. Old mortar compacted by time and cold, the joint stubborn at the deeper sections. She learned the correct angle of the chisel against the stone, the amount of force needed before you stopped gaining purchase and started risking the surrounding stone, the rhythm of working a joint so that the mortar came out in pieces rather than dust. Devon worked beside her on the upper section she could not reach without the abutment step. And he did not explain more than she asked, and she asked only what she needed. She found the rhythm of it by the third joint and lost it by the fifth, when a section came away in one motion instead of pieces and took a sliver of the stone's own face with it. She stopped, looked at the new mark, pale, shallow, an inch of raw stone where there hadn't been one an hour before. Devon came down the abutment without being asked. He didn't take the chisel from her. He set 2 fingers against the joint beside the damage and drew them along it. Slow, showing her the angle instead of naming it. Shallower than the one she'd been using, the blade laid nearly flat instead of driven in square. The stone's older than the mortar, he said. It doesn't know it's supposed to be the strong one. She adjusted her grip and tried the next section at the shallower angle. The mortar came away clean, in 3 pieces, the stone untouched beneath it. Better. He went back up without checking the section after that, and she understood by now that this was its own kind of confirmation. If it had needed watching, he would have stayed to watch it. She went to fetch more water from the river's edge part way through the morning, and it was there, in the mud below the abutment, that she saw it. A rabbit, or what had been one. The carcass barely disturbed except for a single wound at the throat, precise, almost surgical. None of the mess a fox or a wolf would have left chasing it down. No drag marks, no tracks in the soft ground around it that she could match to anything she'd learned to recognize. It looked less like something had killed it than something had visited it. She called Devon down. He crouched over it for a long moment without touching it, and she watched the change happen in him. Not alarm exactly, nothing so readable as that, but a stillness that went deeper than his working stillness, a man doing careful arithmetic and not liking the sum. He picked up a stick and turned the animal with it, once, checking the wound from a different angle, and his jaw set in a way she was starting to recognize as the shape he made around things he'd decided not to say yet. Wolf? She said, though she already suspected the answer. No. He straightened. He did not offer an alternative. Probably nothing. He said it in the voice he used when he was managing information rather than sharing it, and she filed the distinction the way she filed everything now, without commenting on it. He covered it with a flat stone before they went back to the wall. Unhurried about it, the same economy he brought to everything, and neither of them mentioned it again that morning. But she noticed, for the rest of the day, that he worked with his back to the tree line less often than he had before. He worked with his coat off despite the cold, sleeves pushed to the elbow, steam coming off his shoulders where the effort had warmed him past the temperature of the air. At some point in the late morning, when she glanced over to check her own progress against his, She saw his forearm properly for the first time in full daylight. The scar she had noted in the first clearing, the one along his forearm that he never explained, had a second detail she had not registered from a distance. Just below it, at the wrist, there was a discoloration she recognized. The flat, grayish pall that wolf skin acquired when a wound was not healing at the correct rate. She had seen it on Bren, months of it fading by degrees instead of days. She knew what it meant, the way she knew things now, immediately, before she had decided to know them, the old training doing its work before she could choose whether to let it. She looked away before he noticed. She went back to the joint in front of her and worked it with more attention than it required, raking mortar that was already clear, because her hands needed something to do that wasn't standing still with what she'd just seen. He said nothing. If he'd noticed her noticing, he gave no sign of it, and she understood, turning the chisel, finding the angle he'd shown her, that this was probably not the first time he had let someone see something and watched them decide in real time what to do with it. The cold came up from the river in the midday hours, the temperature dropping by degrees the way it did when the season was moving towards something definitive. They cleared the joint, and she mixed the mortar from materials Devon had brought in a bag she had not noticed until he produced it from the pack's edge. Lime, aggregate, water from the river, mixed in proportions he gave her without measuring, by eye and by the feel of the mix between his palms. "How do you know when it's right?" she said, working the trowel through a batch that still looked wrong to her. Too loose in one pass, too stiff in the next. It stopped sticking to itself and started sticking to the trowel. He took a handful from her bucket, worked it between his fingers, let it fall back in. "Close. Not yet." She added a measure of the aggregate he'd set aside and worked it through again. "Too dry," he said, the first time she offered him the result. She added water. "There." She pressed the first section into the joint with the back of the chisel and worked it in with her thumb. The lime was cold and pulled the warmth out of her fingers immediately. They finished the upper joint, then the lower. She came down from the abutment, and they both stood back and looked at the gable. The new mortar was pale against the old stone, stark the way new work always was before it weathered in. "It'll need a second pass in spring," he said, "after the frost season." "I'll know how by then." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly, a small recalibration, a thought he had not finished yet. He picked up the tools and rewrapped them in the cloth. "Weiss, keep these," he said. She did not argue. She took them. He stayed for the midday meal, which was not a thing she had planned and which happened anyway because she had bread from the town and he had produced from the same pack he had brought the mortar materials in, a portion of something slow-cooked that was still faintly warm in its cloth wrapping. Neither of them commented on the fact that he had brought food. They ate at the table she and Elian had built, with the river windows showing the pale midday light and the fire low, and the silence between them was the comfortable working silence of the morning, requiring nothing. She broke the bread and gave him half without asking whether he wanted it, the way she'd started doing with Elian, and he took it the same way Elian did, without comment, as if refusal had never been one of the available responses. He ate with the same unhurried economy he brought to the stonework, nothing wasted, nothing performed. "What is this?" she said halfway through, meaning the slow-cooked thing. "Venison. Rand's mother makes it when someone's been working outside all day." He didn't look up from the bread. "She sends it around. It's not just for me." "You're telling me this wasn't a gesture?" "I'm telling you it started as one and stopped being one 4 years ago." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, almost there. "It's just food now. At one point, he reached for the salt she kept in a chipped dish near the fire and found it empty, and got up and refilled it from a small paper twist he had in his coat pocket and sat back down, and neither of them remarked on the fact that he had been carrying salt. She watched him do it and understood this was evidence of a kind. The mortar bag, the tools, the food, the salt, small things accumulating toward a case neither of them had agreed yet to make. The fire ticked as a knot of wood caught. Outside, the wind moved through the bare birches with a sound like something being sorted. She was watching the light on the river when she said it. The wrist. He was quiet for a moment. She kept her eyes on the river. The thinning, he said. Flat, declarative, no inflection that suggested the word cost him anything, which meant it cost him a great deal. How long? The wrist is new. 6 weeks, maybe 7. He picked up his cup. There have been other indicators, for longer. What kind of indicators? He put the cup down. She turned to look at him. His face was the face he wore when he was making a decision about how much information to give, not closed, not calculating, but doing the specific kind of thinking that preceded honesty, rather than preceded deflection. Healing, he said. I shift and the rate drops by 10%, 15. It was 3% 2 years ago. The aggregate cost of each shift accumulates. He looked at his wrist, at the discoloration she had seen this morning, which he had known she saw. Old injuries reopen, new ones take longer. By summer, if the rate continues, a significant wound would take weeks rather than days. Does it hurt? She said. The slowing. Day to day. He considered this with the same care he gave everything that required an honest answer instead of a diplomatic one. Not the way an injury hurts. He turned the cup in his hands, not drinking from it. It's more like carrying something heavy for long enough that you stop registering the weight as separate from yourself. Then you set it down for a moment, and you feel exactly how heavy it had actually been the whole time. He looked at his wrist. It's easier to carry when I don't stop to feel the difference. She said nothing for a moment. She was remembering how steady his hands had been all morning, setting the chisel, testing the mortar, never once slowing to reconsider a motion he'd already started. You're better at carrying it than most people would be, she said. I've had practice. He set the cup down. Managing the timeline, managing this. It's the same skill, applied to different weight. She thought about the clearing, about the 5 days of negotiation, about Davin standing at the water's edge with every calculation of his adult life pointing one direction and stepping back. She had understood at the time that it cost him something. She was only now understanding the precise dimensions of what he had bet. Corvin knows, she said. Yes. The pack elders. Some of them. His jaw set, just barely. They know what the thinning is. They don't know how far it's progressed. Those are separate pieces of information. You're managing the disclosure. I'm managing the timeline. He looked at her directly. If the pack believes the Alpha is failing before I've secured the succession, the politics become dangerous. Corvin is... He stopped, started again. Corvin's position is complicated. That's a tidy word for it. She set the trowel down harder than she meant to. You're not managing a timeline, Davin. You're managing people. The elders, Corvin, the pack, and me, apparently, since I only just found out how bad your wrist actually is by looking at it myself. She didn't soften her voice to make the next part easier for him. I understand why you do it. I don't think it's malicious, but don't dress it up as strategy when what it actually is is the same thing you do with everything that matters to you. You don't ask, you manage. And I am getting very tired of being managed by people who love me." He went quiet in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Not composed, just absorbing the hit. "That's not entirely fair," he said finally. "Tell me the part that isn't." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had lost some of its careful edge. "You're right that I don't ask. I don't know how to do it the other way. I've had one model for what happens when an alpha lets people see the whole truth before he's controlled how it lands, and it ended with Corvin holding my father while he died mid-sentence." His jaw tightened. "That's not an excuse. It's the only honest answer I have." She sat with that longer than she wanted to, because it was a real answer and she hadn't expected one. "I'm not your father's mistake to manage around," she said, quieter now. "I need you to tell me things, not manage me into finding them out on my own." "I know." He looked at his hands. "I'm not good at it yet." "No," she said. "You're not." She understood what he was not saying. Corvin's silence at the bridge had been a single, costly choice in a 9-year accumulation of resentment. It was not a concession. It was not peace. It was one decision, made once, and it did not alter the underlying arithmetic. "And Elian," she said. Something happened in Devon's face that the Alpha Register did not have access to. It was brief. It was complete. "He's 12. That was all. 2 words, carrying the entire weight of it. The boy sleeping under his roof and eating at his table, and the calculation that ran underneath every other calculation Devon made. Devon's math always came back to Elian. She looked at the table, at the grain of the plank Elian had carried on his shoulders from the pack's storage shed because she needed a surface to work on. "What would resolve it?" she said. "First blood." He said it without emphasis, the way you say a fact you have examined from every angle, and which has not changed regardless of the examination. The oldest accounts suggest that first blood can stabilize the thinning in a bloodline that carries it. Not reverse it, stabilize. A pause. "I have not asked you for anything." "I know. I am not asking now." "I know that too." The fire settled. The river moved. She put both hands flat on the table, on the rough-cut wood that had not been anything until someone decided it was a table, and looked at the pale winter light coming through the window and thought about Devon standing at the water's edge and stepping back. He had not asked. He had come back with bees and a hand on a door frame and tools wrapped in cloth, and he had not asked. She thought about what that cost a man whose entire adult life had been spent in the practice of asking and taking and holding. She thought about what it meant that the one thing he needed most was the one thing he had refused to claim. She said nothing. Neither did he. They sat at the table while the light moved across the floor, and the cold came off the river, and the fire held its heat, and the silence between them was the kind that does not require resolution, because it already holds everything that needs to be said. At some point, he reached over and moved her cup half an inch, so it was no longer sitting in the draft from the window, and set it back down without comment. And she understood this was the same instinct that had built the fire and drawn the map and cleared the joint at the correct angle. Not affection exactly, or not only that, but an inability to leave a small wrongness uncorrected when he had the means to correct it. He stood to go and stopped with one hand on the back of the stool, and she watched him arrive at something and then visibly set it back down, the way she'd watched him set down an unfinished sentence before. "What?" she said. "Nothing." "Say it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind the amber that she had no name for yet, and she thought, for one full breath that he was actually going to. "Not yet," he said instead. It wasn't a refusal. It was closer to a promise, with the date left blank. "I don't have the right words for it, and I'd rather owe you the good version than give you a bad one." That's a very tidy way of not answering. "Yes." He almost smiled. "I'm aware." He left in the early afternoon. She stood in the doorway and watched him cross to the tree line, his coat on, the pack over his shoulder, moving with that particular economy that was either his nature or something he had built over years of being what the pack needed him to be. He did not look back. She had noticed this about him. The clean departure, no trailing. She stood there after he was gone, past the point where standing there served any purpose, because the alternative was going back inside, and she was not ready yet to be in a room that still held the shape of the conversation they just had. She looked at the gable. The new mortar was pale in the afternoon light, already starting to dull as it cured. By spring it would have darkened to match the surrounding stone, and the repair would be invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. She went back inside. She looked at the tools on the shelf, wrapped in their cloth. She looked at the map on the north wall, the one Devon had drawn, with its 4 words in the corner. She unfolded it and found a pen and added a 5th word at the end of his 4. "The roof needs checking." Done. She pinned it back. Outside, a bird called from the east bank birches. 2 notes, the second lower than the first, repeated twice. She did not know which bird it was, and for a moment the not knowing sat easier than anything else had all day. It asked nothing of her. It did not require a timeline or a disclosure or decision about what she was willing to become in order to fix it. She stood at the river window and looked at the bare branches until she found it. Small, gray-brown, sitting on a branch that bent slightly under its weight. It called again, and was answered from somewhere in the upper canopy, further toward the forest. A second bird, unseen, responding to the first the way the first had clearly expected it to. She found paper and a pen. She wrote, "Small, gray-brown, east bank birches, 2-note call, descending, repeated." Another bird answered from upper canopy, forest side, Tuesday, late afternoon. She put the paper on the table. Elian would want the record, and she found, setting the pen down, that she wanted to be the kind of person who kept one, who noticed the small, answerable things and wrote them down on a day when the large ones had refused to be answered at all. Chapter 11. What Corvin Keeps. She found the wolf on the stone by accident. She had gone down to the boundary stone in the gray hour before full light, restless in a way she hadn't named yet, and there it was, sitting on the flat top where she had sat on her first night when neither side had taken her in. Small, carved from pale wood, mid-stride, one foreleg lifted, the head turned slightly as if the animal had caught a sound and was orienting toward it. She stopped a full pace short of it, the way she'd stopped short of anything unexplained left somewhere she'd been sleeping. Nothing moved in the tree line. The river ran the same as it always ran. She picked it up. The carving was not polished. The wood surface still carried the small irregularities of the knife's work, slight undulations in the grain that a sander would have removed. It was rough in the way of something made by hands that were skilled, but not precious about the result. She turned it over. No marking on the base, no initials. She checked the ground around the stone for tracks and found nothing the frost hadn't already erased, and stood there a moment longer running through everyone who might have a reason to leave a carved wolf on a rock at dawn. The list had exactly one plausible name on it, and one she wasn't ready to rule out yet. She set it back where it had been. She found a second one the following morning, balanced on the corner post of the east gable, the same pale wood, a different pose. A wolf sitting with its weight on its haunches, patient, waiting. She left that one too. She almost missed the other thing. It was only because she'd crouched to look at the wolf's underside, checking again for a maker's mark, that she saw it at ground level. 3 parallel gouges in the post itself, below the carving, too high off the ground for anything that walked on 4 legs and too deep to have been made by a bird. The wood was pale and raw where they cut through the weathered gray surface, recent. She ran a finger along one and found it wider than her finger and did not have an animal in mind that made a mark that shape. She told herself it was nothing she recognized yet, which was not the same as nothing, and left it, the way she was learning to leave most things in this pack until someone with more context arrived to explain them. On the 3rd morning, there was one on the window ledge, on the outside, visible from the river path. This one was mid-turn, the body caught in the moment of changing direction. On the 4th morning, she got up before first light and sat with the window cracked and waited. Pause. Corvin came at dawn. He moved along the river path from the forest side with the silence of a man who has spent a great many years being careful about where and when he was seen. He carried a small knife in one hand and a piece of pale wood in the other, and he walked with his head up and his attention on the path, and he did not look at the window. She watched him the way she had watched Devon cross the same ground 2 weeks before, and found the same thing true of the father's beta that had been true of the son. Something in the shoulders eased when no one was confirmed to be looking. Not relief exactly, more like the difference between a door held shut and a door simply closed. He stopped at the corner post. He looked at the wolf she had left on the ledge, the mid-turn one. He examined it the way you examine something that has already been evaluated and found acceptable. Then he set the new one beside it. Another figure, this one in full run, the legs extended, caught at the forward reach of the stride. His hand paused on the post itself, just below where he'd set the carving. Whatever he'd been about to do next, he didn't do it. He crouched instead to look at the gouges in the wood at closer range, running 2 fingers along the closest one, the way he'd examined his own stiff hand a few minutes earlier, checking it, sorting it, filing it away for later. Whatever he concluded, his face gave her nothing. He straightened, and his eyes went once, briefly, to the deeper forest beyond the gable. The same direction, she would realize only later, that had drawn Corvin's attention at the tree line days before, and then he composed himself back into the same unhurried stillness he'd arrived with, and continued. He turned to go. She let him get 1 full step before she spoke, weighing the cost of staying silent against the cost of losing the only unguarded few seconds she was likely to get from this man for a long time, and decided the information was worth more than the silence. "They're well made," she said through the window. He did not startle. The pause was half a breath. Then he turned, and the bronze eyes found her in the window with no particular surprise in them, only the recalibration of a man whose plans have been adjusted by circumstance. "They're functional," he said. She opened the door. He came in with the same deliberate lack of ceremony he had used at the bridge gap in the early morning 2 weeks ago. He looked at the room, at the table and the shelf and the books and the fire and the tools on the south wall and the map on the north wall with its additional word. He registered all of it without offering a response to any of it. She put water on for tea because it was early and cold, and it seemed like the correct thing to do in a room with a fire when someone arrived at dawn. She had exactly 2 cups. Elian's spare bowl had become one of them, weeks ago, without either of them deciding it formally. and she set both out before she'd fully decided whether he was staying long enough to use his. He sat on the stool, not invited, not uninvited, and put the knife and the remaining wood on the table and folded his hands. He did not fill the silence while the water heated. She found she didn't need him to. She set a cup in front of him and kept one for herself, and sat on the floor with her back against the fireplace stones because there was only one stool. He did not comment on this arrangement. "How long have you been leaving them?" she said. 15 years at border markers, 12 years at pack buildings, 8 days at this house. Why? He didn't answer that. He turned the question back on her instead, without softening the angle of it. "What are you doing with him?" he said. "Devon, I want the honest version, not the one you'd give Sable if she asked." "I'm not doing anything with him. I'm living at a boundary he happens to visit." "That's the diplomatic version." His bronze eyes held hers, unimpressed by the phrasing. I watched him step back from a claim 9 years of pack law would have supported in front of both factions for you. "I would like to understand whether you have any idea what that cost, or whether you simply accepted it the way you'd accept a fact that was useful to you." She felt the old reflex arrive. 20 years of practice smoothing a room before it could see what she actually felt. And for once, she didn't use it. "You can ask me that once," she said, "because you loved his father and you're frightened for him, and I understand where it comes from. If you ask me again, I'm going to stop being generous about the framing." She held his gaze and did not look away first. "I know exactly what it cost him. I was there. I have thought about very little else since, and I don't owe you an accounting of my intentions before I've finished deciding what they are, which is true and which is also not the same as not caring." He looked at her for a long moment, the bronze eyes running their usual unhurried arithmetic, and something in his posture shifted by a degree. Not surrender, but a recalibration, the look of a man revising an estimate upward. "That," he said, "is closer to the answer I was hoping for than the answer I expected." "I noticed you asked anyway." "I did." He didn't apologize for it. "I needed to hear whether you'd flinch." She let the silence sit before she spoke again. "You still haven't told me why." He looked at his hands, at the left one, the one that had been stiff in the cold the morning at the bridge gap. He turned it slowly, examining it with the flat attention of a man conducting an inventory. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then his hand moved to the wood on the table, not picking it up, just resting against it the way a person rests a hand on something solid before saying a thing that isn't. "Corvin taught Devon to carve," he said. "When Devon was 14, Caden, his father, asked me to find something for the boy to do with his hands during council sessions. He was restless. Couldn't sit still through the long discussions without his attention wandering." He paused. The pause was not theatrical. "I taught him the way my father taught me. It took." He looked at the wood on the table. What I did not expect was that Devon would outgrow the restlessness and keep the habit. He gives everything he makes away. I keep nothing. She thought about Elian's room, about the 3 carvings that Devon had made and given and not acknowledged. "The ones you leave?" she said. "Who are they for?" He looked at her, the bronze eyes direct and without warmth, doing the thing they did, reading, categorizing, deciding what was safe to confirm. "For the record," he said finally, "that someone was here, that something was tended." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Devon's father," she said. Tell me about him. The silence that followed was not the silence of refusal. It was the silence of a man opening a room he does not open for anyone, checking the state of what's inside, deciding whether the inventory can be spoken aloud. Caden was the last alpha I would have followed without question. He said it with the flatness of a fact that has been examined so many times it has lost its edges. Not because he was stronger than Devon. He wasn't. Not especially because he was right. His judgment on things that mattered, pack law, territorial decisions, who deserved what kind of loyalty, was right in a way I have spent 9 years measuring everything else against. He stopped. He died mid-sentence, at a negotiating table. The other faction's alpha pressed a point, Kadon stood to respond, and he was gone before he reached full height. A pause. I caught him. She did not speak. He had been my alpha for 27 years. The words were precise and stripped of everything except their weight. I had been his beta, his second, the person who carried the things he could not carry in front of the pack. When he died, I had no one to carry things for and nowhere to put what I was carrying. He looked at the cup she had given him, which he had not touched. Davin was 23. He became alpha under pack law. I became his beta. The pack needed the continuity and I provided it. And you resented him for it. I resented the blood right. He was precise about the distinction. Not Devon. Devon was 23 and had just buried his father and inherited a pack that was watching him for any sign that he would collapse under the weight. He did not collapse. He had not been trained for it, and he did not collapse. Something moved in his face that was not admiration and was not quite something else. I resented that the elders gave the seat to blood rather than merit, and I told myself the resentment was principled, and it was also the only place I could put the grief without it breaking something I could not afford to have broken. The fire shifted. The river ran. She looked at the wolf figures on the table, the one he had been carrying when she stopped him, unfinished still at the back legs, and let the quiet hold longer than was comfortable, because she had learned from both of these men now that silence was usually where the truest answer finished forming. What broke, she said, when you chose silence at the bridge? He picked up the cup, drank, set it down with care. Nothing. He looked at the fire. That is the thing I have been examining. I was certain at the moment that not pressing the first blood claim would cost me. The elders were present. Pack law was on my side. Everything I had been waiting 9 years to prove was in that clearing. He paused, and I looked at Devon's face. He was watching Mara, the way his father used to watch Devon's mother, the way a man watches something he has decided matters more than the outcome he was working toward. He said it with complete neutrality, as if he were reporting on weather conditions. I have not seen that expression on Devon before. I recognized it anyway. She looked at him. So you said nothing? I said nothing. He turned the cup. I have spent 9 years accumulating the proof that blood right was the wrong criterion. In that moment, I possessed the proof and I chose not to use it. I am still examining what that means about my argument. It means your argument was never the real thing. He looked at her sharply, not with anger, with the expression of a man who has just heard a sentence he has been trying to form for a long time and has not managed. The real thing, she said, was that you loved Caden and he died, and Devon has his eyes, and you have spent 9 years holding the grief at arm's length by turning it into a principled position, which is... She stopped. She was not going to tell him what it was. He was not asking her to. He sat with it for a long time. The morning light came through the river window and fell across the table, across the unfinished carving and the knife in his folded hands, and she watched something settle in his shoulders that she recognized from watching Devon carry weight he would not name. The specific stillness of a man deciding not to move until he trusted what his voice would do. "You are," he said, extraordinarily direct for someone who spent 20 years in a vampire matriarch's house. "I learned directness from the man who came to claim me at a bridge." She looked at him. He was not gentle about it. Something moved at the edge of Corvin's face that she had not seen before. Not a smile. The muscles for it were too long out of use. The suggestion of what a smile would look like on that face, briefly visible and then gone. Davin is not gentle about most things he has decided matter. He picked up the knife, the unfinished wolf. He turned it in his hands, found the place where he had left the back legs rough, and began working the wood with the same unhurried economy that she recognized from the hives, from the mortar joint, from every specific task she had watched Devon execute. The carving gesture itself was identical. He learned that from me. She watched him work. The knife moved in short, certain strokes, the wood curling away from the blade in thin ribbons that fell onto the table, and she found herself cataloging the economy of it, the same way she'd cataloged Devon's hands on a mortar joint 2 days before. Not the technique, which she couldn't have named, but the restraint. Neither of these men wasted emotion on anything that didn't need it. She was beginning to suspect that wasn't a coincidence of temperament. It was inheritance, passed hand to hand like the knife itself. "The thinning," she said. His hands did not pause. "Yes." "He told me." "I know he told you." The knife moved. "He has not told the elders how far it has progressed. He has told you." A pause. "I notice you are here and not in the forest, and you are not with the coven, and you are at a table that Elian carried from pack stores, and a boy who does not give his trust to anything carried it on his own shoulders because you needed a surface to work on." He stopped carving, looked at the figure in his hand. "Devon's math all runs through Elian. It always has. If you understand that, you understand why I said nothing at the bridge. First blood in hostile hands does not save Elian. First blood at the boundary." He set the wolf down on the table, finished now, the back legs clean. "Is a different calculation?" She sat with that. It reframed something she had assumed for weeks, that Corvin's caution was about pack law, about precedent, about the abstract architecture of blood right he had just spent the better part of an hour explaining. It had never only been that. Somewhere underneath the political calculation was a boy carrying a plank on his shoulders, because a woman he trusted needed a table, and a man willing to set aside 9 years of principle rather than risk that boy's safety on the wrong outcome. She looked at the figure, at the 4 wolves on the table and the window ledge and the corner post, placed over 4 mornings by a man who left marks in places that had no audience. "Leave the next one somewhere, I'll find it," she said. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was slower than the flicker of not quite smile from before. Longer to arrive, harder to read, and she understood she had just offered him something no one in this pack had offered him in longer than she could guess. "As a constant," she said, "not a variable." He stood. He wrapped the knife in the cloth he carried it in and put it in his coat. He looked at the map on the north wall, the one Devon had drawn, the one with the added word at the end. He said nothing about it. He went to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, which she was beginning to understand was a gesture both he and Devon used when they had one more thing to say and were deciding whether to say it. "The thinning takes what it takes," he said. "It does not respond to strategy. It responds to blood." He did not look at her. I have no claim on what you do with that information. I am observing that I have placed the information in front of you." He paused, his hand still on the frame, and for once did not seem in a hurry to finish leaving. "One more thing." He still did not look at her. "He's going to ask you for something eventually." "Devon?" "Not the thinning. Something else. Something he wants for himself, which he has had almost no practice wanting." His jaw was tight. "When it happens, he will not do it directly. He will bring you wood, or fix something, or say the true thing sideways inside a sentence about bees, and let you decide whether to hear it. It is how I taught him to survive council sessions, and it is a terrible way to ask someone to love him." He finally looked at her. "Don't let him get away with it. Make him say it plainly, once, out loud. He needs the practice, and you deserve better than a man who only tells you the truth in code." She did not have an answer ready for that, and he did not wait for one. She understood this was Corvin's version of the thing Devon had said at this same table only days before. "I have not asked you for anything. I am not asking now." Except Corvin, who owed her nothing, had just asked anyway, sideways, in a sentence built so carefully that no piece of it could be quoted back to him as a request. He went out. She sat for a long time with the fire behind her and the sound of the river filling the space where Corvin had been. She picked up the mid-turn wolf, the second one she'd found, and turned it over in her hands the way Corvin had turned his own at the bridge gap. An inventory, not a caress. She set the 4 wolves in a row along the edge of the table, boundary stone, gable post, window ledge, running. 4 mornings of a man tending something without asking to be thanked for it. It was the only language he had left of the person he had loved and lost mid-sentence, and he had been speaking it in a wood no one else was reading. Then she picked up the running wolf, the one she had found on the boundary stone on the first morning, and put it on the shelf between the books, where it would stay.
Chapter 12. The Name of the Thing.
Elian arrived on a Wednesday with the feather box, a length of rabbit gut cord he had found useful and thought she might find useful, and an expression she had not seen on him before. The expression of someone who has been composing a speech for 3 days and has arrived at the place where it must be delivered. She was at the table, annotating the bird record she had started keeping. 11 entries now, 9 species, 2 of which Elian had identified for her on a previous visit, and one of which she had identified herself from the description in a natural history volume she had found in Seraphine's library and not returned. The morning outside had gone gray early and stayed there, the kind of flat gray that didn't lift so much as thin toward noon, offering no shadows and no warning of what was coming. The table under her elbows was a good table, sturdy despite the roughness of the joinery. Elian had carried the plank for it on his own shoulders from the pack storage shed weeks ago, before either of them had a name for what they were building here. She had not decided what to do with that fact yet, so mostly she didn't look at it directly. She did not look up immediately when he came in, either. She had learned that with Elian, a certain amount of not looking provided useful cover for the things he needed to say. He set the cord on the table. He put the feather box on the stool. He checked that the door had shut behind him, though it had shut on its own the way it always did. He straightened the cord on the table, though it hadn't needed straightening. Then he stood in the center of the room with his arms loose at his sides, in the specific stillness of someone holding a decision in both hands and not yet sure which one he means to set down first. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. It's about Devon." She put the pen down. "Sit." He did not sit. Elian's version of composure involved standing in one place and not moving, which was the opposite of his usual register and therefore always meant something. "He's not sleeping," Elian said, or, "He's sleeping but not properly. He used to be asleep before I was, and now he's up after I am, and he was already up when I get up, and I know because I check." He said this last part in a tone that made clear he was aware that checking was a thing he was not supposed to admit to. Also, he's not carving. He hasn't carved anything in 2 weeks, and he didn't eat all of what I made him last night. Just moved it around the bowl until I stopped watching him do it. She looked at the running wolf on the shelf. "I know about the thinning, Elian." "I know you know." His jaw tightened in the way it did when he was working toward the actual point. "He told you because you're..." He stopped. Started again. "He doesn't tell people things. He doesn't explain himself to anyone except..." Another stop. "He brought you food. He drew you a map. He repointed your gable." "Yes. He doesn't do those things." Elian was watching her face with the inventory expression. "For people, I mean. He doesn't do them for people." "I understand what you're saying. I don't think you do, actually." He picked up the feather box and put it down again and looked at the window. The river was doing what it did in the late mornings, catching the light where it moved fastest, flat gray where it pooled. The pack is his. Everything he does is for the pack. That's just true. Even the bees are. He says they're not about the pack, but they're still on pack territory, and he still brings the honey in. Everything he does connects back to the pack. He looked at her. "Except the gable." She said nothing. "The gable is just your gable." Elian's voice had gone to its quieter register, the one that did not require filling. "He fixed it because it needed fixing, and you live here. That's the whole reason. There's no pack benefit to your gable being sound." He paused. "I have been watching him for 2 years, and I have never seen him do something that was just for a person." She looked at the map on the north wall, at the 4 words in the 5th one she had added. "He's afraid," she said. Not to Elian particularly. But Elian was the person in the room. "Yes." Elian sat down on the floor, cross-legged, the feather box in his lap. The floor sitting was a thing he did when he was done with the performing composure part and was into the actual conversation. Not of dying, of Elian. He said his own name the way Devon said it. As a fact, not a feeling. He thinks... I know what he thinks because I've heard him talk to Corvin when they don't know I'm in the corridor. He thinks if he dies before I'm old enough to hold my own in a pack succession, the pack politics will... He made a gesture that encompassed a general catastrophic outcome. And Corvin will... Another gesture, this one specific and not generous toward Corvin. And I'll be... The third gesture was the smallest, and she understood what it meant. Alone again. "Elian. I'm not... It's fine, I'm not..." He stopped, pressed both hands against the feather box lid, the old careful grip. "I just think you should know what the stakes are, for him, because he's not going to tell you because he doesn't ask for things." He looked up. "He didn't ask you at the bridge. He came back with bees. And you're here, and that's good. That's really good, but the thinning is..." His voice went flat in the way it went flat when the chatter stopped and he was speaking from somewhere that predated words. "The thinning doesn't wait." She sat with that. The fire was low. She got up and added wood and stayed crouching in front of it, watching the new piece catch, the smell of wood smoke sharper before it fully caught. The heat that came off the hearthstones after an hour of burning, held in the stone and given back slower than the flame itself. "What do you want me to do?" she said. "I don't know." He was honest about the not knowing in the way children were honest about it, without the adult habit of dressing ignorance up as something more strategic. I wanted you to know the whole thing, not just the part he told you." He paused. "He told you the thinning was real and how fast it was progressing. He didn't tell you what it's doing to him. The not sleeping, the not carving, the..." He touched the scar on his forearm without seeming to notice he was doing it. "He's carrying it by himself." She looked at his hand where it had gone still against his forearm, resting over the old scar tissue without seeming to notice it was there. He never pulled the sleeve down over it. He never seemed to remember to. She understood then what Elian was actually doing. He was 12 years old, and he had survived one culling, and the scar was the one part of that history he let anyone see without meaning to. He had come here today because Devon was the second thing he had ever managed to keep, and he did not know how to keep a person the way he knew how to keep a feather, catalogued, dated, safe inside a box with a lid that closed. So he had done the only thing that was inside his power. He had gathered the facts, in order, the careful way Corvin gathered facts without meaning to teach anyone how, and carried them to the one variable in the whole arrangement that existed outside the closed loop of pack politics and alpha succession and a beta's 9-year grievance. He had come to tell her because she was the only variable he could talk to. She looked at him, at the feather box in his lap, and the door he'd checked twice without noticing he'd checked it, and the whole small architecture of a boy trying to keep the last of what he had intact. "The bird record," she said. "The one I've been keeping." He blinked. The shift in topic registered as unexpected. "Yes. I found a nest yesterday, on the east bank, in the fork of the largest birch. I think it was used last season. There were remnants of lining material still in it. I couldn't identify the species from the nest structure alone." She looked at him. "Could you?" He was very still for a moment. The composure speech mode had fully resolved. He was back in the world of actual things that needed actual thinking, which was, she had come to understand, the only world where Elian was entirely comfortable. "What kind of lining material?" "Moss and something finer, pale. I thought it might be down, but I'm not certain." She closed the record. He stood up, put the feather box on the stool the way someone sets down a thing they've been taught not to break twice. "Can I see it?" "That's why I mentioned it." They went out together, the cold coming off the river in flat sheets in the midday hours, the sky gone the pale, unbroken gray that preceded real winter, the kind of sky that gave no shadows and no warning. Elian's breath showed in front of him in short, business-like clouds. He did not talk on the walk. She had learned this about him too, that the not talking on a walk toward a fact was different from the not talking that preceded a hard thing being said, and that the two were not difficult to tell apart once you knew what to listen for. He stopped once, short of the birch, and stood listening with his head tipped, the same posture he used for identifying a call before he'd see the bird that made it. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He didn't sound certain of that. This stretch is usually louder, wrens mostly in the underbrush. He looked up and down the bank, the quick cataloging pass he gave anything he was trying to account for. "It's probably nothing." He said it the way she'd started to notice people in this pack said probably nothing, as a placeholder for something they had decided not to finish thinking about yet. He didn't mention it again, and neither did she, though she noticed him listening for it twice more before they reached the tree. She led him along the east bank to the birch, and he stopped below it and tipped his head back and looked up into the fork for a long moment before he touched the bark at all. "You didn't take it down," he said. "I didn't want to disturb it before you'd seen it in place." Something in his face eased at that. Some small tension she hadn't clocked as tension until it left. He went up the trunk with the automatic confidence of a child who had been climbing trees since before he could name a reason for it. One hand finding the low burl, a boot braced against the second fork, and then he was up and settled with a forearm hooked around the branch and his face inches from the nest, entirely unhurried about the cold or the height or anything except the thing in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. "Long-tailed tit," he said down through the bare branches. "The lining is feathers, not down. They use hundreds of them, sometimes over 1,000, and they lay them all facing the same direction, tip toward the entrance." He turned something over between two fingers, a scrap of lining pulled loose. "This one used at least 14 species. I can tell because the barb structure's different between them, even from a distance if you know what you're looking for." "How do you know what you're looking for?" "Corvin taught me some of it. The rest I worked out from getting it wrong first." He came back down the trunk in 3 economical drops, landing soft, brushing bark dust from his palms. "I'd need to check the exterior binding to be sure. Spiderweb, usually. Sometimes lichen worked in for camouflage, but the interior profile is right for long-tailed tit and wrong for almost anything else that nests this low." "You're not going to just tell me it's a long-tailed tit, then?" "I could." He considered the nest again, tipping his head, weighing something she couldn't see the shape of. "But you'd write it in the record as certain, and it isn't. Not yet. It's the best answer I have with what I can see from here." He said it without any unease about the incompleteness, as though not knowing yet were simply a stage, a fact passed through on its way to being solid, the way water passed through fog on its way to being river. "I don't like putting a name on something before I've earned it." She made a note, wrote long-tailed tit, probable in the column she'd left for uncertainty, and under it, E confirmed interior profile, exterior unconfirmed. They stood for a moment at the base of the birch, looking up at the empty nest in the fork, the pale lining barely visible now that he was no longer beside it to point at what mattered. "Elian," she said. "Yes." "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. The inventory expression. Checking for the thing adults said when they meant it, and the thing they said when they meant something adjacent to it. Whatever he found, he appeared to accept. "Okay," he said. He reached into the feather box. He'd carried it out without her noticing, and produced a feather. Small, pale gray, slightly curved, with a faint darker edging. He turned it in his fingers. "Long-tailed tit feather," he said. "From last year's catch. I've been holding it back because I wasn't sure where it fit in the system." He held it out. "Put it in the record, for the nest." She took it. They walked back to the house together in the quiet of the midday hours, and the river ran beside them, flat and gray and moving faster than it looked like it should in the cold. And the forest stood on the other side of it, bare enough now that she could see deeper into it than she'd been able to a month ago. Neither of them spoke. The thing that needed saying had been said, and Elian, she was learning, did not fill silence for the sake of filling it the way some people did. He treated a good silence the way he treated a confirmed nest, as something that didn't need improving. Halfway back, he stopped to examine a print in the mud at the river's edge, crouching without being asked, running 2 fingers along the outer edge of it with the same unhurried attention he'd given the nest. "Fox," he said. "Not pack." He straightened. "You can tell because it doesn't drag the 4th toe." She hadn't asked. He told her anyway, the way he told her most things. because the fact existed, and she was there, and telling her was cheaper than carrying it alone. They came up on the house from the riverside, the smoke from the banked fire still finding its way out through the chimney in a thin gray line that matched the sky almost exactly. And Elian went ahead of her to the door the way he always did now without asking, the way a person moves through a place that has already decided to hold him. Pause. Devon arrived that evening after dark. He knocked, which he had never done in the first weeks and now did every time, a small courtesy he'd added without explanation and never dropped. She said, "Come in." He stood in the doorway a moment longer than usual, and she watched him take the room in the way he always did, table, shelf, fire, the map on the north wall, except tonight. His eyes caught on the table and stopped, and something in his shoulders went still in a way she recognized now, having watched Corvin do the same thing in this same doorway 8 days before. She was at the table with the bird record open and the long-tailed tit feather pressed flat beside the new entry, and he looked at the feather for a long moment before he looked at her. "Elian was here today," she said. "I know. He told me things you hadn't told me." Davin came in. He did not sit. He leaned against the wall the way he did when he intended to stay long enough to say something and not a moment longer, and he looked at the fire instead of her, which she had also learned was not avoidance so much as a way of keeping one thing steady while he worked at another. He was carrying the folding knife, turning it over and over between two fingers. The carving tool, the one he had not been using. Not carving with it now, just holding it the way a person holds a thing that used to mean something and might again, if they could remember how. "What did he tell you?" "That you're not sleeping." She looked at him directly. "That you haven't been carving, that you haven't finished anything in 2 weeks." He looked at the knife like it had spoken out of turn, put it in his pocket. "Elian notices more than I account for," he said. "Yes." She closed the bird record, keeping one finger between the pages to hold the place. "He loves you. He's 12, and he's watching you the way a person watches the one thing standing between him and a version of the world he's already survived once. That's not a small thing to carry into a room and set down on someone's table." The word landed, and Devon received it the way he received most things that cost him. Without movement, without expression, in the complete stillness of a man who has trained himself, for reasons that went back further than she had full access to yet, not to let what he felt become legible to anyone who hadn't been watching for a very long time. She had seen that same stillness settle into Corvin's shoulders over tea. The morning he told her about a man dying mid-sentence at a table 27 years into a loyalty that had nowhere left to go. It was not a family resemblance drawn in faces. It was drawn in what these men did with their hands when the only alternative was letting something show. "I know," he said. "That's why he came." She put her hands flat on the table. He couldn't fix the thing himself, so he came to tell the one person he thought might be able to. Not because he was asking for anything, because he had information that was relevant, and the person it was relevant to was here. Devon looked at her for a long moment. "He told you to help me," he said. "He told me the whole shape of the problem." She held his gaze. "That's different." He pushed off the wall. He came to the table and stood across it from her and put both hands flat on the surface the way she had, and looked at the bird record and the feather and the lamp and every object on the table that was not her face, in the order of a man taking inventory of a room he was about to say something difficult in. Then he looked at her. "I don't know how to ask for things," he said. "I haven't needed to." "I know." She thought of Elian's room, 3 carvings sitting on a shelf that Devon had made and given and never once mentioned again. Gifts delivered like facts and never followed up on, as though asking whether they'd been kept might obligate him to admit he'd wanted them to be. You give things instead, I've noticed. The thinning, what I need from it. I told you I was not asking. You told me, and then you came back every day and fixed things and brought food and drew me a map. She kept her voice even, without edge. That is asking. You just do it without words. It's not only you. I watched Corvin do the exact same thing at this table, and neither of you seems to know the other one does it too. He didn't answer that directly, but something in his stillness changed for a moment. The closest thing to surprise she'd seen on him in days. That's not a criticism, she said, though it had come out close enough to one that she let herself say it plainly instead of taking it back. But I'd rather you just told me. I'm tired of doing the translation myself. I don't know if I can. Try. He was quiet for a long time. The fire, the river, the folding knife in his pocket that he was not using. I don't know, he said, what you're willing to give. He said it, and then looked, briefly, at the door, the way a man looks at an exit he has already decided not to use but once confirmed is still there. She stood. She came around the table instead of answering across it, close enough that he had to decide whether to hold his ground or step back, and he held it. I don't know either, she said. Not yet. She looked at him and did not let him look away. But I know I'm here, and I know the thinning doesn't wait. She picked up the long-tailed tit feather and set it carefully between the pages of the bird record and closed the cover over it. So let's start with what we know, and see what the ground turns out to be made of. He looked at her, close enough now that she could see exactly how much it cost him to stay still instead of closing the last of the distance between them. Then he pulled the stool out from the table and sat down across from her, put both hands on the surface and stayed. Chapter 13. Old Paper. The messenger arrived on a Thursday in the early afternoon from the town side. She was updating the long-tailed tit entry when she heard him. A good 3 lines already committed in ink, the feather Elian had given her pressed flat between the pages where it would stay until she decided the entry was finished enough to close the book on it. The house had gone quiet in a way it did most afternoons now, not empty exactly, but holding its breath between one visitor and the next. Outside, the sky had the flat, scraped clean look that meant no snow yet, but no promises either, and the river ran the color of old pewter under it. Mara heard the footsteps on the river path before she saw who made them. Lighter than Corvin, more deliberate than Elian, not Davin's gait. She had learned all 4 of those without meaning to, the way a person learns which stair creaks in a house they've lived in long enough. She was at the table with the bird record, and she closed it and stood and turned toward the door, which was open because the midday hours brought enough pale winter light that it was worth the cold to have it. A young vampire stood at the threshold. She did not know him. Young in the vampire sense, which meant nothing about his actual age, but there was a quality to his face she recognized as recent turning, the specific unfinishedness of someone whose centuries had not yet settled into the composed authority that Seraphine's older coven members carried like a second skin. He had a sealed letter in one hand and the look of someone who had been given precise instructions about how to deliver it and was following them precisely. From Seraphine, he said. I see that. She held out her hand. He gave her the letter and took 2 steps back, which was not quite leaving but was not waiting to be invited in either. His eyes went once around what he could see of the room from the doorway. The table, the shelf, the map on the north wall, with the quick, cataloging attention of someone who would be asked about it later and wanted the answer to be accurate. Then his eyes came back to her and stayed there, carefully. The way you look at a fact you've been told is dangerous and have decided to treat politely regardless. The seal was Seraphine's. Dark wax, the coven mark, the impression of a ring she had worn for longer than anyone Mara had ever spoken to could estimate. She had seen this seal on 100 letters in the letter room. She had never received one herself. She broke it. The letter was not long. 4 sentences in Seraphine's handwriting, which was the handwriting of a woman who had learned to write when permanence was the primary virtue of the act, each letter formed with the unhurried precision of someone who understood that what was put on paper might outlast the world that produced it. I am aware that you are living at the river crossing and that you are well. I do not write to dispute your choices or to argue what has already been decided. There are things you do not know about your bloodline that I have not told you. They are not things I was keeping in resentment or in strategy. They are things I kept because I was afraid of what knowing them would do to you, and that fear was mine and not my right to act on. I would like to tell you, on your terms, at a time of your choosing, I am not asking for anything in return. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it on Seraphine's own creases and held it in both hands and looked at the river through the open door, the pale winter light on the water, the east bank birches bare and still. The young vampire was still at the threshold. "Tell her I received it," she said. He nodded and left. She listened to his footsteps on the river path, going back toward the town, back toward the fog and the amber-lit windows in the letter room full of correspondence addressed to the long dead. She did not go to Devon with it immediately. She sat with the letter for 2 days. She put it on the shelf beside the bird record and the running wolf and the 3 books from Seraphine's library, and she looked at it from across the room while she worked, and she did not open it again. She did not need to. She had read it 3 times and she knew it well enough. On the first day, Elian came by after his morning rounds with a report on the kingfisher he'd been chasing for a week. A flash of blue-orange low over the water, gone before he could confirm the crown pattern, which meant it went in the record as unconfirmed, recurring rather than as a name. He didn't ask about the letter on the shelf. He noticed it. She watched him notice it, the quick inventory pass his eyes made over any room he entered. And he said nothing, because it wasn't in the categories of thing he'd decided were his to ask about. She was grateful for that in a way she didn't try to explain to him. On the second day, it snowed for an hour in the morning, not enough to stay, and she spent part of it on the roof checking the mortar Devon had set, running her thumb along the seam the way he did, feeling for anything that had shifted in the cold. Nothing had. The gable held the way it had held since the day he'd fixed it, solid under her palm, indifferent to the letter waiting for her 1 floor down. She came down with her hands raw and stood for a while at the window, with the letter visible on the shelf behind her reflection in the glass, and did not go to it. What she was sitting with was not the content. The content was straightforward. Seraphine had information about her bloodline that she had withheld, and she was offering to give it now, without conditions. The content did not require 2 days of deliberation. What required 2 days was the question underneath the content. Did she want to know? She had spent the last 3 weeks building something from nothing at the seam between 2 territories. She had a table and a stool and a shelf and a fire that drew cleanly and a bird record with 12 entries and a map on the north wall and wolf figures in 3 places around the room, and an arrangement with Devon and Elian that had no name but was real in the way that the house itself was real. Not because it had been declared, but because it was there, because it held things. What she did not have was any understanding of why her blood did what it did at the clearing. The ancient register in her voice, the one that stopped wolves and stilled vampires and came from nowhere she had been taught, and nowhere she could locate in her own body when she went looking for it afterward. She had spoken in that voice, and the world had changed around her. She did not know what she had used. Seraphine did. On the third day, she went into the forest, the cold sharper under the bare canopy than it had been at the house, her breath marking the air in short bursts as she followed the deer track that had become, over 3 weeks, something closer to a path. Devon was at the linden stand when she found him, crouching at the second hive with both hands on the wood, his coat shed and folded over a low branch despite the cold, sleeves pushed back. He heard her coming and did not turn, which meant he had identified her by sound before she was close enough for him to see. She came and stood beside the hives and waited while he finished the last 2 boxes, watching his hands move over the wood with the same unhurried economy she'd come to recognize from the mortar joint, from the carving, from nearly everything he did that required not breaking a thing that mattered. He stood, wiping his palms on his trousers, and looked at her properly for the first time since she'd arrived. Not at the hives, not at the tree line, at her. "You didn't bring the record," he said. "You always bring the record." "Not today." "I got a letter," she said. "I know." He looked at the hives. The young one from her coven has been in the town this week. The pack noted his movements. He paused, and something in the pause had a different weight than the rest of the sentence. They also noted he wasn't the only thing moving. Whoever had the Southern Watch 2 nights ago logged a disturbance near the old crossing markers. Nothing they could describe beyond a feeling that the ground had been walked on recently by something that didn't want to be tracked. No prints held, no scent carried past the water. He looked at her. "It's probably unrelated to your letter. I'm telling you because I've stopped deciding on your behalf what you need to know." "Of course," she handed him the letter. He read it. His face did not change. He refolded it and gave it back. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to know what she knows." She held the letter. About the bloodline, about the voice at the clearing, what it is and what it does and where it comes from. She looked at him. "The first blood accounts you mentioned, what do they say about it?" He put both hands on the nearest hive box, not listening this time, just steadying. "The oldest accounts describe it as a third inheritance, not vampire, not wolf. Something that predates both, that surfaces in bloodlines that carry the crossing of both strains." He paused. "Every account describes it differently. Some call it a sovereignty. Some call it a word and a language that predates the division between our kinds. Some say it is simply the voice of something old enough to remember when there was no division." He looked at the trees above them. "None of the accounts say how to access it, or what it costs." "Seraphine would know the accounts. Or have sources we don't?" He said it without bitterness. It was simply true that Seraphine had 400 years of accumulated knowledge, and the pack's oral tradition was older in some respects but narrower in others. "She is very old." "Yes." Mara looked at the sealed fold of the letter. "She is also the person who raised me and lied to me for 20 years and has now written 4 sentences that do not ask for anything." "You don't trust it." "I don't trust it, and I think it's probably true." She kept her voice even. "Those are not contradictory." He looked at her with the amber attention, reading. "She loves you," he said. "I know she does." She put the letter in her coat pocket. "So do you." She said it plainly, without building up to it and without softening it afterward, and then let the silence that followed actually be a silence instead of filling it herself. He didn't deny it. He didn't do anything with his face at all, which she was learning to recognize as its own kind of answer. The stillness of a man who has just heard something said out loud that he has never once said out loud himself, and is deciding in real time whether the saying changes anything. "I know," he said finally. He said it cleanly, without deflection, and it cost him something to say it that plainly. She could see the cost, even if she couldn't have named its exact shape. "That has stopped being a reason to let either of you make decisions for me." She watched his face. "I'm not comparing you to her." "I know that too." He said it cleanly, without deflection. "I'm saying she's old enough and careful enough that a letter asking for nothing usually contains, somewhere, the thing it is actually asking for." He paused. "Find it before you agree to a meeting." She thought about this, about the 4 sentences and the things they did not say, about a woman who had spent 20 years arranging a world around one person's safety and was now, for the first time in Mara's memory, asking for something in the way you ask for something, when you know you have forfeited the right to ask outright. "I am not asking for anything in return." She almost laughed, not because it was funny. "You know what this is," she said, and held the letter up before putting it back in her pocket. "This is the same thing you do, the same thing Corvin does. Fix the gable, bring the bees. Open the archive room you've had a reason not to open for 9 years. Never once ask for the thing you actually want." She looked at him. "She's just better dressed about it than either of you." Something moved behind his eyes, quick, there and gone. Not quite surprise, more the recognition of being caught doing a thing he hadn't known was visible from outside. "That's not a comparison I expected," he said. "I didn't expect to make it." She put her hand back in her pocket, over the letter. "But I watched Corvin do it at my own table, and I've watched you do it every day for 3 weeks, and now I'm reading it from the woman who raised me. It's not a coincidence anymore. It's a language the 3 of you speak and none of you admit to knowing." He was quiet for a moment. "Which is also true," he said, "and also the most effective possible thing to say to a person who has just refused 2 different kinds of ownership." "Why do you do it?" she said. "You could just ask. I'd probably say yes to half of it." "You say that like it's simple." "It is simple, it's 1 sentence." Her voice had an edge on it now that she didn't try to file down. "I want this. Will you give it to me?" Words exist for it, Devon. You use them for everything else. Mortar ratios, border patrols, the correct angle for a chisel. You only lose the ability the moment it's something that actually matters to you, and I am getting tired of being the only one in this arrangement who says the true thing out loud. Something flickered across his face, there and controlled and gone, and for a moment she thought she'd pushed too hard. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave anything that wasn't rhetorical. "Because asking makes it a request," he said. "A request can be refused, and I'd have to watch that happen. Bringing something and leaving before you can say no costs me nothing I can see." He looked at the hive box, not at her. "I know that isn't the same as it costing nothing." She held that for a moment. It was, without question, the most honest accounting of the habit she was likely to get out of him, and it did not make her think less of him. "She wants to see me," Mara said. "The information is real. The wanting to see me is also real. She has wrapped one inside the other because she knows I'll come for the information, and the seeing me is what she actually needs." Devon was quiet. "She is," Mara said, "exactly as good at this as she has always been." "Yes." And I am going to go anyway." He did not argue. He would not argue. She had made a decision, and it was hers to make, and whatever Devon's instincts about Seraphine were, he had learned, in the span of 3 weeks, to separate his instincts from her authority over her own choices. "When?" he said. "When I've decided what I want to know and what I'm not willing to offer in return for knowing it." She turned the letter over in her coat pocket, feeling the folded edge through the wool. "Which is not yet." "All right." They stood in the linden stand while the cold settled around the trees and the dormant colonies held their warmth inside the boxes. The hum was there if she put her attention on it. She could feel it at the edge of her awareness now, when she was this close, even without her hands on the wood. "What I want to understand," she said, "is whether it's a thing I can learn to use or a thing that uses me." Devon looked at her. "At the clearing," she said, "I didn't choose it. It rose when both factions were pressing simultaneously. It stopped when the pressure stopped." She kept her eyes on the middle distance. "A power you cannot choose is not a power. It is a condition." He was quiet for a long time. "The accounts say both things," he said. "That it surfaces under duress, and also that the ones who learned to live with it eventually found the conditions under which they could call it deliberately." He paused. "None of the accounts describe anyone living with it successfully without someone who knew what it was to help them understand it. Seraphine? Or another source?" He turned toward the trees. "There are older records in the pack archives than anything I've read. Corvin has the key to the archive room. He has had it for 9 years, and I have not asked him to open it." He stopped. "I am asking him now." She looked at him. "He'll open it," he said. "He's been waiting for a reason to stop holding things back." She thought about the morning in the house, Corvin with the knife and the unfinished wolf, telling her about Caden and the grief he had made into principle, about the 4 words on the gable and the running wolf on the boundary stone. "Ask him," she said. She wrote back to Seraphine that night. She tried 3 versions first, sitting at the table with the fire built up and the shutters closed against the cold. The first ran to half a page and read, when she looked at it again, like an argument. Every sentence defending a position nobody had attacked. She crossed it out. The second was short and sounded like Devon, all economy and no give, and she recognized what she was doing, borrowing a register that wasn't hers because it felt safer than her own, and crossed that out too. She almost kept one line from the second draft. "I would rather hear it from you than read it from an archive, because it was true and because admitting it cost her something." She crossed that out as well. It was not information Seraphine had earned yet, whatever the letter said about not asking for anything. The third time, she stopped trying to sound like anything and simply asked the thing she actually wanted to know. Not agreement, not refusal. A single question, direct, with no preamble. "What is the name of what I am?" She sealed it with the candle wax she used for the bird record entries when the paper was damp and the ink required anchoring. Not a coven seal, not any seal she had been given by someone else. The imprint of her thumb into warm wax, which was the oldest form of attestation and the most personal and the one that could not be borrowed or forged. She took it to the boundary stone in the early dark, the cold biting harder before dawn than it had all the previous evening, her breath going white and vanishing in front of her with each step. She set the letter on the flat top where the young vampire would pass on his morning route, the same stone where she'd sat on her first night at the boundary with neither side willing to claim her, and pressed her thumb once more against the wax, out of habit rather than necessity, feeling the ridge of her own print already fixed there. Then she went back inside and banked the fire and sat at the table with the bird record closed and the wolf figures on the shelf and the map on the north wall and the folding silence of the house around her. She did not know what Seraphine would say. She knew what she needed to hear, and she had lived at this boundary long enough now to understand that wasn't the same thing as what was coming. Whatever came back in the next letter would tell her more about both than 20 years of silence ever had. Outside, the river ran. Somewhere in the upper canopy of the East Bank birches, a long-tailed tit shifted on its roost, one note in the dark and then quiet. The house held its usual sounds around her, the fire, the river, the quiet of 3 weeks of a life she had built without asking anyone's permission. And she let herself sit inside all of it for a while before she moved. She put her hand flat on the closed cover of the bird record, the way Devon set his palm against a hive box before he opened it, feeling for what was moving inside before he ever lifted the lid. She did not move it. Chapter 14. The Thinning. Corvin opened the archive room on a Saturday morning. 9 years he'd held the key without turning it for anyone. Devon told her that much before he left, not as an explanation, just as a fact worth having, the way he handed her facts when he didn't know what else to hand her. She did not go with him. The pack archive was pack territory, and going into the forest for the linden stand was one thing. Going into the interior of Hallamere buildings was another, and she did not want to establish a precedent she had not thought through. Devon went. She spent the morning at the house and found that waiting for information about her own blood was a different discipline than waiting for anything else had ever been. She updated the bird record. A wren, tentative, seen once at the base of the woodpile and not seen again, and found she'd written the same 3 words twice without noticing, crossed them out, and closed the book rather than keep making the same mistake. She checked the mortar on the gable again, though nothing about it had changed since the last time she'd checked it. She stood at the river window longer than the view justified, watching the water do the same thing it always did, and made herself stop looking for a shape on the path before it was reasonable to expect one. The cold had a different quality than it had the day before, drier, sharper at the edges, the kind that meant the ground would hold a footprint by nightfall. By mid-morning she gave up, pretending she was doing anything but waiting, and sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood and waited properly, the way Devon waited at the hives, without motion, without narrating it to herself as patience. He was gone most of the morning, and when he came back to the house he had a sheaf of papers under one arm, not copies, the originals, old enough that the pages had gone stiff at the edges and the ink in the center had faded to brown. He set them on the table. He looked tired in the specific way of a morning spent doing something that mattered more than it looked like it did from the outside. Not the thinning tired she'd learned to watch for, just ordinary fatigue, a man who'd spent 3 hours crouched over old paper in a cold room. Corvin stayed to help sort them, he said before she asked. He knows the room better than I do. He's the one who found the 3rd account. Said it had been misfiled for years. Filed as though it belonged to a different bloodline entirely, and nobody had thought to check. He rubbed at his eyes with the heel of one hand, a gesture she hadn't seen from him before. I think finding it mattered to him more than he said. Why? I don't know yet. He looked down at the papers. I didn't ask. It felt like a thing to leave alone until he offered it. He was quiet a moment. There's one other thing. Corvin said the misfiling didn't look careless once he looked closely at it. Whoever shelved it that way did it well enough that it survived 2 archive reorganizations without being caught. He said a mistake usually gets fixed the first time someone reorganizes a room. This one didn't. It got preserved. He looked at her. He didn't have a theory for why. Neither do I. I'm telling you because you'd want to know, not because I think it means anything yet. She looked at the top page without touching it. The writing was in a script she did not immediately recognize, not any of the languages she had been taught, not the treaty tongues or the old diplomatic registers. Something older, with a character set that had elements of several languages but was not entirely any of them. Can you read it? Parts. He sat across from her. The pack elder who maintained the archive before Corvin could read the full script. She died 11 years ago, and Corvin learned what he could from her, and it wasn't enough. He turned the top page carefully. This section, he pointed to a block of text at the upper left, is a description of the bloodline, what it is called, what it was understood to be. What is it called? He looked at the page. The word he said was in the old script's sound system, 2 syllables, a consonant cluster she did not have in any language she knew. The pack's oral tradition translates it as the threshold blood, he said. The older accounts use a different translation, something closer to the voice between voices. He paused. The accounts that use that translation describe it as a language that predates the divergence of our kinds, when vampires and wolves were not distinct, when there was one kind of being, and it spoke with a voice that both inheritor lines still carry the memory of. He looked at her. Not a power, a memory. Every vampire and wolf alive has the ancestral memory of being the same thing. When First Blood speaks, it speaks in that memory's language, and every being in the room recognizes it below the level of thought. She sat with that. A sovereignty, Devon said, reading further down the page. A word in a language that predates the division. You already told me that. Almost exactly that. She looked at him. At the hives, 2 days ago. He looked back at the page, then at her, and something in his face acknowledged the overlap without needing her to explain it further. The pack's oral tradition and the archive both trace back to the same original accounts, he said slowly, working it out as he said it. I didn't think about it as quoting until you said it back to me. I learned this the way I learned to carve, from someone who learned it from someone else, going back further than anyone still living can name. He turned the page. It isn't new information. It's confirmation that what we already knew was recorded correctly. She had been right, regardless of where the words came from, that it was not a power in the conventional sense, not something she had access to as a tool, not a skill to practice or a strength to measure. It was a resonance, a signal that said, "You knew this once before you were what you are now." The accounts of the bloodline itself, she said. What do they say? Devon turned 2 pages. This section was in a more legible hand. The threshold bloodline appeared, according to the oldest record, approximately 500 years before this document was written, which the archive elder estimated at roughly 1,200 years ago. It is not a created lineage. It emerged from a natural crossing, a wolf and a vampire pairing in a period before the territorial division was established. He scanned the text. The children of that crossing did not inherit the abilities of either parent in the conventional sense. They inherited the space between the abilities, the resonance. And the line persisted. In small numbers, always rare, always carrying the resonance. The archive elder's notes count perhaps a dozen names across 12 centuries, and half of those are marked uncertain, a rumor of a resonance rather than a confirmed one. He looked at her. The last confirmed member before you, according to the pack archive, died approximately 40 years ago. An old woman, no children, who had spent her life at a border crossing in a region the Hallowmere line is not native to. A pause. The record doesn't say how she died, only that she did, and that nothing carrying the resonance was recorded again until the clearing. He turned another page, searching, and did not find more. There are no details about how the bloodline passed to your immediate family. That record, if it exists, is not in the Pack archive. 40 years. She filed the number away without knowing yet what she would do with it, the way she filed away every fact that arrived without its edges fully drawn. Seraphine would have it. Yes. She looked at the papers. At 1,200 years of a lineage that produced people who stood between things, between factions, between languages, between kinds, and had no category within any of the existing structures. The thinning, she said. What do the accounts say? Devon did not answer immediately. He turned another page, reading. She watched his face. The scar that bisected his left eyebrow. The lines at the corners of his eyes that belonged to a man a decade older. His hands on the old paper, the same deliberate care he brought to the hive boxes, to the mortar joint, to every task that required not breaking a thing that mattered. The threshold blood is described here as a stabilizing force, he said finally. Not a cure. The thinning is a degeneration of the wolf bloodline's regenerative capacity, and it responds to the resonance in a specific way. He paused. The account says, the voice between voices slows the forgetting. The bloodline that is thinning, in the presence of first blood, loses the deterioration at a rate proportional to... He stopped. Read the next section again. It is not clear. The proportional relationship is described in terms that the archive elder's notes say she was not certain how to interpret. But it works. There are 3 documented instances in the archive. He closed his hand on the edge of the page without pressing. 2 of them are plainly written. A bloodline holder, a first blood, months or years of shared proximity, an immeasurable slowing the record keeper thought worth writing down twice, once in the original account, and once in a summary a generation later, as if she didn't trust the first version to be believed. He turned another page. The 3rd is the one nobody agrees on. All 3 show stabilization. None of them show reversal. The thinning does not go backward. It stops moving. Stops moving. She heard her own voice come out flatter than she meant it to, and then not flat at all. You've been sitting on it stops moving. Not it gets better. Not you recovered for 2 years, and you told Elian before you told me, and you were going to let me find out exactly how bad the wrist was by looking at it myself, and you call all of that managing the timeline. She stood, because sitting still had stopped being possible. You could die of this. Slowly, in front of a 12-year-old who already survived losing 1 alpha, and you've been treating it like a scheduling problem. He didn't flinch from it, which somehow made it worse. Yes, he said. I have. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. He set the page down. I don't know how to hold something that large without turning it into a task. It's the only shape I know how to carry weight in. I'm not defending it. I'm telling you it's true. She stood there with the anger still in her, no longer certain what to do with it, now that he'd simply absorbed it, instead of giving her something to push against. I'm not angry at you, she said finally, which was not quite true, and they both knew it. I'm angry at the shape of it, at there being a version of this where you just stop and nobody gets a vote. I know. He looked at her, steady, not asking her to take it back. You're allowed to be both. She sat back down. She did not apologize, and he did not ask her to. Devon was 32 years old. The thinning had been progressing for at least 2 years that he could identify, though what Corvin had told her at the Linden stand made her suspect the true beginning was harder to date than that. If it stopped now, if the rate dropped to 0 or near it, he had the lifespan of a healthy wolf alpha ahead of him, which was not the lifespan of an immortal but was long. Elian would be grown. The succession would be settled or unsettled on its own terms, without the clock running. She looked at the discoloration on his wrist, where the healed wound had left that flat gray pall. "The documented instances," she said. "How did it happen? What was the mechanism?" He turned the page. She watched his face as he read. She had learned to read him by now. Not the managed surface, but the layer beneath it, the one that appeared when the management cost too much. He read the relevant passage twice and then set the page down and looked at the table. "Proximity," he said. "Extended proximity. Weeks in 2 of the instances. Days in the 3rd, but the 3rd account is disputed." He looked at her. The first blood was present in the bloodline holder's daily life. They were in contact regularly. The accounts are not specific about what kind of contact. A pause. The pack elder's annotation says, "The resonance does not require ceremony. It requires presence." Presence. She was here. She had been here for 3 weeks, 21 days, though she hadn't been counting until just now. And the counting itself told her something about how much this mattered that she hadn't examined directly before. She was within a kilometer of the pack's center every day. Devon was at her house every day or every other day. Elian was at her table every morning, featherbox in hand, treating the arrangement as settled fact rather than something that might still be negotiated away. "Has it slowed?" she said. "The rate in the last 3 weeks." He was very still. "I don't know," he said. "I don't have a baseline precise enough to measure 3 weeks against." He kept his eyes on the papers. "The wrist is the same. The sleep." He stopped. "Elian told you about the sleep?" "Yes. It's better. In the last week." He said it with the flatness of a man reporting data. "I don't know whether that is the thinning or whether it is other factors." She looked at the river window, at the pale winter light on the water. "It could be me," she said. "Yes? Or it could be that you've stopped running a political crisis and started sleeping somewhere familiar." "Also possible." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her already. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. The clearing. He chose each word with the deliberateness he used for things that mattered. When the voice came, "What did it cost you afterward?" She had not been asked this before. Seraphine had not asked. Devon had not asked until now. She turned the question over before answering, the way she'd learned to turn over anything he asked directly, because he asked so rarely that when he did, the question had usually been sitting in him a long time before it reached his mouth. "Nothing I could name," she said. "Tired. The way you're tired after something that required full concentration. Not depleted." She thought about it. It was not like using a muscle. More like being used as a channel for something that was already there. The cost was the maintaining of the ordinary after. She paused. Like having stood in cold water. The water passes, and for a while afterward you carry the temperature of it. He listened the way he listened to the hives, fully without interrupting. "How long?" he said when she'd finished, before the temperature left. "A day, maybe 2. She hadn't thought to measure it at the time, only after, reconstructing the edges of something that hadn't announced when it started or when it ended. I didn't know to watch for it going, so I don't have a precise answer. I have an estimate. That's more than I had an hour ago." He said it plainly, without the weight she might have expected him to put on it, and she understood that for him, this was simply how information was supposed to work between two people who intended to keep being honest with each other. Collected, kept, added to the total. Not romanticized, just useful. "I want you to understand," he said, "that I am not asking you for it. I am not asking for anything. I am telling you what the accounts say, because you asked me to find them, and you have the right to the information, and what you do with it is yours." He put both hands flat on the table. "I have done enough claiming." She looked at his hands, at the careful, deliberate way they rested on the rough wood. "You said the resonance requires presence," she said, "not ceremony." "Yes." "Then we don't need to decide anything." She put her own hands on the table, a foot from his. "I'm here. You're here every day. The house is at the boundary. If proximity is the mechanism, it's already working or it isn't, and the decision has already been made by the fact of us being in the same place." He looked at her hands, then at her face. "That is," he said, "the most efficient possible resolution of a 1,200-year-old medical question." Something moved in her that had nothing to do with the deep voice, nothing to do with the resonance, closer to the feeling of watching an entry in the bird record, finally resolved from unconfirmed to confirmed, except the thing being confirmed was not a bird. "I learned from a man who doesn't waste words," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The amber was the direct attention, unguarded, the one that appeared when the alpha was absent. Whatever he found in her face, he received without expression. Then he turned back to the papers and began making notes on a blank sheet in the tight, economic hand she'd come to recognize as his. Not the map hand, which was precise and spatial, but the thinking hand. Words laid down in the shorthand of a man working through a problem in writing because the problem was too large to hold in his head. She went to the fire and built it up and put the kettle on, and came back to the table and sat across from him and watched the pages. "Read me the third account," she said. "The disputed one." He found the page. It was shorter than the others, the hand less careful, as though whoever had copied it had been working from a damaged original and transcribing what could still be read rather than what had originally been written. "It's fragmentary," he said. "The archive elder's notes call it unreliable and flag a disagreement with an earlier translator over one term in particular." He smoothed the page flat. "I'll read it as written, not as interpreted." He read, "In the 3rd year, the bloodline holder failed and did not fail. The first blood was near him, nearer than the other's record, nearer than the word for nearness usually holds. Some say beside, some say within reach. The old translator marks it otherwise, that the word here is not the word for distance at all, but a word used elsewhere for the joining of hands at a binding, and there is no consensus on which the scribe intended, only that the bloodline holder did not worsen that year, and the first blood did not leave him." Devon set the page down. "The elder who annotated it thought the translator had made an error," he said. "Conflated two words that happened to share a root." She argued the account describes ordinary closeness, the kind the other two accounts describe outright, without ambiguity. She may have been right. He looked at the page rather than at Mara. "I don't know enough of the old script to have an opinion of my own. I only know that nobody since has settled the argument, because nobody since has had a reason to need the answer." She sat with the phrase a moment longer than she needed to. The joining of hands at a binding. It was, whatever else it was, A strange thing to have just heard read aloud across a table from a man who had spent the entire conversation being careful not to touch her. "You don't have an opinion," she said, "or you're keeping it to yourself. Both can be true." He didn't quite smile, but something in his face loosened by a degree. "I've read that passage more than once this morning. I still don't know which reading I believe. I know which one I'd choose, if choosing were how it worked." "It isn't." "No." He looked at his own hands, flat on the table, a foot from hers, exactly where they had been for the better part of an hour. "It never has been, with us. Choosing." Corvin's papers stayed spread across the table for the rest of the afternoon. 40 years and 1,200 years, and one disputed account, and neither of them moved to put them away. Outside, the river moved over its stones in the cold afternoon, and the dormant colonies in the linden stand held their warmth in the dark of their boxes, and the fire settled in the hearth, and the light shifted by degrees from white to the paler gold that meant the day was already turning toward evening, without either of them having noticed it start. They sat at the table in the house at the seam, while the winter light moved across the floor, and neither of them named what they were to each other. They did not need to. The room already knew. Chapter 15. Fracture. The elder came on a Monday. The morning had started ordinary enough. She'd been up before light, restless in a way 3 weeks of good sleep can make a person when it finally breaks for one night, and she'd spent an hour before full light rereading the archive notes Devon had left on the table. Not because she expected to find something new in them, but because rereading them felt like doing something with the restlessness instead of just having it. Not one of the younger pack members. Not Bren, who had become a regular presence on the river path now that his arm had healed. Or any of the wolves she had begun to recognize by gait and sound from inside the house. This was a woman Mara had not seen before. Old enough that her hair had gone fully white. Compact rather than small. Her frame carrying the particular density of someone who had never stopped being useful. Her face carried the deep-set lines of someone who had spent decades outdoors in every kind of weather, without concern for what the weather did to skin. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out gray that had gone lighter with age, unsettling in direct conversation. The quality of a woman seeing slightly more of the room than the room currently contained. She walked with a stick, dark wood, uncarved, the handle worn smooth by a grip that had used it for a very long time. The walk itself was not slow. Mara understood within the first several seconds that the stick was not for balance. She stopped at the open door. "Mara." Not a question. "Yes." "I'm Sable." She said it without title or qualification, the way people said names when the name was sufficient. "I sit on the Pack Elder Council. I've come to look at the house." Mara stepped back from the door. The elder came in with the same unhurried deliberateness of all the pack members she had encountered, looked at the room the way all of them looked at the room, receiving it, cataloging it, deciding what it meant, and then sat down on the stool without being invited and put her stick across her knees. She let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke again, with the patience of someone who had conducted a great many first conversations and had stopped needing them to move quickly. "You have a bird record," she said, looking at the table. "Yes." "Alien system." His approach, my application of it. Sable looked at the shelf, at the wolf figures and the books and the running wolf on the end. "Corvin's work." She said it without surprise. "He's been putting them on the border stones for 15 years. Nobody has said anything." She looked at Mara. "That is not an accusation. It is an observation about what the pack tolerates in silence." Mara sat on the floor with her back against the fireplace stones. What does the Elder Council want to know? Whether you intend to stay? I do. On what terms? My own. She kept her voice even. I have no standing within the pack hierarchy, and I'm not seeking any. I have a house at the boundary that belongs to neither the pack nor the coven. I'm here because I chose to be, and I'll leave if I choose to, and neither of those decisions will be made for me. Sable looked at her for a long moment. The pale eyes held on her longer than was comfortable, reading. The council has 3 members who are satisfied with that answer, she said, and 2 who are not. Which are you? Sable looked at her with something that might have been the ghost of approval for a direct question answered directly. I have not decided what I am formally, because formal positions on the council require formal justification, and I prefer to reserve mine until I've seen enough to justify it properly. A pause. Informally, I think the pack is better with you in it than without you, and I have thought that since the 2nd week. I am telling you this because it costs me nothing to tell you, and it may be useful for you to know you are not friendless on the council, even if I am not prepared to say so in session yet. What do the 2 want? Clarity about your relationship to the Alpha. She said it without drama, as if it were a practical question about weather or border schedules. The pack hierarchy does not have a formal category for what you appear to be, and the absence of category is producing political friction. What kind of friction? Sable's hands tightened slightly on the stick. Not much. Enough. The fire popped once, a piece of green wood finally catching, and neither of them looked at it. Corvin has been quiet, she said, for 3 weeks. In 9 years, Corvin's silences have always been specific. They mean he is waiting for something, not that he has resolved anything. She looked at the fire. There are 2 younger pack members who follow Corvin's position on succession. They have been asking questions about the thinning. Specific questions, not general ones. Someone has told them more than they should know about the rate. Mara looked at her. Corvin. I don't know. Sable said it with the specificity of a woman who knew exactly and was not going to say. What I know is that the questions are being asked, and Devon is aware of the questions, and the council's ability to manage the situation depends on what your position is. She turned the stick in her hands. Not because we need your permission, because the pack is watching Devon, and Devon is changed. In the last 3 weeks, the pack can see it. He is sleeping. He is at the hives. He is at this house. She looked up. Wolves read what their alpha attends to. He attends to you. The pack is waiting to understand what that means. Mara thought about the archive papers on the table, about the resonance requires presence, about 3 weeks of proximity and Davin sleeping, and the wrist that was no better but no worse, and the carving knife back in his pocket. He is not attending to me for their benefit, she said. No. Sable's voice was dry. That is the difficulty. She stood slowly, with the ease of a woman who has made peace with the mechanics of age without requiring sympathy for it. I am not here to ask you to perform for the pack's comfort. I am here to tell you that the comfort question will resolve itself one way or another, and it would be better for everyone if it resolved in a direction someone with good judgment had considered in advance. And Corvin. The old woman was at the door. Yeah. Corvin is a man who has been right about a great many things for a very long time, she said. Being right and being trusted are not the same thing, and he has spent 9 years confusing them. She looked back. He is also a man who, 3 weeks ago, chose not to use a weapon he had in his hand. I have been watching Corvin for 40 years. I have never seen him discard a weapon. She paused at the threshold, her stick against the frame the way Corvin and Davin both paused at doorways when they had one more thing to decide whether to say. The morning Kadon died, there was frost on the ground and none in the trees, she said, apropos of nothing Mara could immediately place. I don't know why I still remember that. I remember it anyway. She looked at Mara with the pale eyes that saw more of the room than the room contained. I find that the details that stay are usually the ones that matter, even when I can't say why yet. Sit with that, if you like, or don't. She left. Mara stood in the doorway for a while after Sable had gone, looking at the frost that had, in fact, burned off the grass by mid-morning, but was still visible in patches under the eaves where the sun hadn't reached. She did not know what to do with the detail Sable had left her, so she left it where it was, unresolved, and went back to work. Pause. Devon arrived that evening and she told him. He listened with his coat on, standing at the window, looking at the river. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Which two elders?" he said. "She didn't say." "Fennec and Osel." He said it the way he said things he had already worked out. Fennec has been on the council for 30 years and has been waiting for Corvin to make a viable move the entire time. Not against me, against the arrangement that put me in this seat instead of an open challenge. He turned from the window. Osel is younger and follows Fennec the way Vale follows Ran. Every generation produces its own pairing of the same two temperaments. He turned fully to face her. They're not wrong to be asking questions. The thinning is real and the succession is not settled. Their job is to care about the pack's continuity. He sat on the stool. My job is to manage the timeline. And Corvin leaking the rate. I don't know that it was Corvin. Sable does. He looked at her. Yes. He put his elbows on the table. Corvin and I need to have a conversation we have been circling for 3 weeks. He chose silence at the bridge and I have not thanked him for it. Or acknowledged it. He stopped. I didn't know how. He's not waiting to be thanked. I know. He looked at the wolf on the shelf. The running one. The first one from the boundary stone. He's waiting to know whether the silence was a permanent decision or a temporary one. Whether his loyalty to me as a person, rather than to pack law as a principle, is going to hold. He turned the folding knife in his pocket. She had learned to recognize the small shift in his coat when he was doing it. He is asking me the same question Sable is asking by different means. What is the question? What are you? He said it flatly, without drama. Not in the bloodline sense, in the structural sense. What do I call what you are to me, and what does the pack call it, and does the calling of it change anything? She looked at the table, at the rough-cut plank that Elian had carried, and the rough ground marks the chisel had left when she had worked at the mortar joint, and the bird record and the archive notes Devon had made in his thinking hand and not taken with him. Every object in the room had become an answer to his question, whether either of them had meant it to or not. The table alone was an argument. She didn't need to invent one. The pack will call it what it sees, she said. Which is what Sable said. You're here. You attend to this house. Whatever you and I have decided or not decided between us, the pack reads it as a commitment. She met his eyes. They're not wrong. He was very still. No, he said. So Corvin's question is whether that commitment changes your position on the succession. Whether your judgment is compromised by it. She kept her voice level. That's the word he'll use. Compromised. Yes. She made herself ask it plainly. The way she'd learned plainness got her further with him than anything softer would have. Is it? He looked at her for a long time. The amber, direct reading. No, he said. What I feel about you and what the pack needs from me are not in conflict. They have never been in conflict. The problem is not my judgment. He paused. The problem is that Corvin does not have a framework for an alpha who wants something for himself and is also making good decisions for the pack, because his model for that is Caden, and Caden died in the middle of a sentence. His jaw set. So Corvin's architecture for personal attachment and leadership responsibility has been, these things cannot coexist, because the one time he saw them coexist, the personal attachment cost Caden his life. The fire ticked and settled. The river ran on outside, indifferent to any of it. She sat with what he'd just handed her, not the political read, which she'd have arrived at eventually on her own, but the fact that he'd clearly been carrying this specific understanding of Corvin for longer than 3 weeks, maybe longer than she'd known him, and had never once said it aloud to the person it was actually about. "You've known this the whole time," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Long enough?" He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask him to. Some economies were his to keep. "You need to tell him that," she said. "Yes." "Not in those words, but that." "No." He almost smiled. "Not in those words." He stood. He went to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. "The 2 younger members who are asking questions about the thinning," he said, "they'll come to you." "I thought they might." "Don't answer them." "I wasn't going to." She looked at him. "But I'm also not going to pretend I don't know what I know. If they come here, they'll see the archive notes on the table. I'm not hiding them." He looked at the table, at the sheaf of notes in his own hand. "Good," he said. "Let them see." He left. Pause. They came the next morning. She did not sleep well that night, not from fear exactly, but from the specific alertness of a person who has been told, twice in one day, that she has become load-bearing in a structure she did not build and cannot see the full shape of. She got up once in the dark and stood at the window with the fire banked low behind her, watching the black shape of the far bank, without watching for anything in it, and made herself go back to the stool rather than stand there working herself into a state over 2 young men she hadn't met yet. She spent part of the morning rereading the archive notes again, for the second time in 2 days, and found that this time she was reading them differently. Not for what they said about the thinning, but for what they said about her. A woman who had never had a category and now had a house full of people arguing about what to call her anyway. She left the notes open on the table when she was done. If Ran and Vial wanted to see them, she decided, they could see them exactly as Devon had left them. 2 young wolves, male, moving with the coordinated energy of people who have aligned themselves to a position and are supporting each other in it. She saw them coming along the river path from the forest side and stayed at the table and did not go to the door. Meeting them on her own threshold, seated, unhurried, said something different than meeting them standing in the doorway, the way she had for Sable. And after last night, she had decided deliberately which message she wanted to send. The nearer one moved with a held, compact tension, like a door closed carefully enough to be more noticeable than one simply shut. The one behind him carried his height loosely, comfortable in a way the first one wasn't, though something in how he held his shoulders said the comfort was at least partly a decision rather than a fact. They stopped at the threshold. She looked up. "We heard the archive was opened," the nearer one said. "His name was Ron. She had learned names from Elian's monologues. He was 20-something and had the quality of someone whose certainty had not yet been tested against a situation it couldn't manage. Corvin's archive. Davin's archive, she said. Corvin holds the key. Davin has access. Davin had it opened. Yes. The second one, Vial. Elian had mentioned him in the same breath as Ran, the way you mention two things that always appear together. Looked at the papers on the table. She had not put them away. His eyes moved over the top page without asking permission to, the quick pass of someone gathering what he could before anyone thought to stop him. What does it say? About the thinning. She kept her voice neutral. That first blood stabilizes it, not reverses, stops the progression. She watched their faces. Which means the alpha is not dying, which means the succession question remains exactly as settled or unsettled as it was 3 weeks ago. And the stabilizing. Rand stopped. He did not have a word for it, and she was not going to give him one. I live here, she said. Devon comes here. The archive says proximity is the mechanism. She looked at him. Does that answer your question? Rand looked at Vial. Something passing between them, a recalculation. She watched it happen without pretending not to. The quick, wordless negotiation of two people deciding, in real time, whether the plan they'd walked in with still applied to the conversation they were actually having. Corvin said, Rand started. What Corvin said is between you and Corvin, she said. Come to me with your own questions. I'll answer the ones I can. A silence. Are you Pack? Vial said. The question landed clean and direct, the way Elian's questions landed without cushioning. She looked at both of them, at the archive notes, at the wolf figures on the shelf. I don't know yet what I am in the terms your hierarchy uses, she said. I know I'm here. I know I'm not leaving. She met Vale's eyes. That's the answer you can carry back to whoever sent you. Rand's jaw worked once, like he'd meant to say something else and thought better of it. He said it anyway. Yeah. You don't know what you are because you've never had to be anything, he said. Vampires raised you soft, and now you're deciding whether wolves are worth the trouble, and either way, when it stops being convenient, you get to leave. Elian doesn't get to leave. None of us do. You're the only person in this whole arrangement with an exit. It landed. She felt it land, not the words themselves, which she could have dismantled with half an hour and a clear head, but the speed of them, the fact that some version of that fear had been sitting in her, unexamined, since the day she'd walked away from Seraphine's domain with nowhere fixed to walk toward. She did not let it show on her face. She was aware, distantly, that not letting it show was itself a kind of confirmation of everything he'd just said about her training. I could have left 3 weeks ago, she said, and made herself say it slowly instead of fast. I have a table I built with my own hands and a fire I keep and a bird record with your own Alpha's ward as a co-author. That's not an exit, that's a foundation. If you want to argue I haven't earned the right to call it one yet, that's a fair argument. But don't tell me I don't know what staying costs. I gave up the only home I'd ever had to find out. Rand didn't have an answer for that. Vial put a hand briefly on his arm. Not a restraint exactly, more a reminder that they'd come with a plan and this wasn't it. Vial just nodded, the small, precise nod of someone filing an answer away, rather than accepting or rejecting it. They exchanged another look. Then they left. She sat for a while after they had gone, looking at the river through the window, running back through the conversation for anything she might have given away without meaning to. She found nothing. That was either good technique or good luck, and she decided not to examine which. Then she picked up her pen and added to the bird record. a pair of long-tailed tits on the east bank birches calling to each other across the gap of water. She noted the time. She noted the direction of the call. She noted that the second bird answered from the forest side, quick, almost overlapping the first. The kind of overlap that meant the two birds were close enough now not to need the usual pause between call and answer. The gap between the calls was shorter today than it had been yesterday. She wrote that down too, and left out what it might mean, because the bird record was for facts, and she had learned, the hard way, over 3 weeks in one clearing and a great many careful people, exactly how much could be lost by writing down a guess as though it were a certainty. She banked the fire before dark and went out once more to check the wood pile, and it was on her way back that she noticed it. Frost already on the grass along the river path, though the afternoon had held above freezing for hours, and the ground under the eaves, where Sable had stood that morning, was still bare. She crouched and put 2 fingers against it, cold and real, and confined to a strip no wider than the path itself, as if something had walked the boundary recently enough to leave the ground colder in its wake than the air around it had any right to explain. She thought of Sable's voice at the door. The morning Caden died, there was frost on the ground and none in the trees. She did not know what to do with that, so she did what the old woman had told her she was allowed to do with it. She left it where it was, unresolved, and went back inside. Chapter 16, Uncertain Ground. Devon and Corvin spoke on a Wednesday evening in the forest, away from the pack buildings. She did not know this while it was happening. Thursday came in low and gray, the kind of cold that settled into the skin rather than cutting it, and she'd spent the morning the way she'd spent the 2 before it. At the table, going back through Davin's archive notes, though she'd long since stopped expecting to find anything new in them, the bird record opened beside them with its long-tailed tit and its unconfirmed wren, and a blank line where the next entry would go once she had one worth writing. The fire wanted feeding. She hadn't gotten to it yet. Outside the window, the river ran the same flat, colorless gray it had been running for a week, and she'd caught herself twice already watching the water instead of the page. She knew what had passed between Devon and Corvin, only because Elian arrived that morning with the feather box and a quality of suppressed energy that meant he had information he was deciding whether to volunteer. She waited. He lasted approximately 4 minutes. "They talked last night," he said. "Devon and Corvin. I heard part of it." A pause. "I wasn't supposed to hear it. I was in the corridor and the window was open and sound carries in cold air." He looked at his hands. "I didn't stay. What did you hear?" Devon told him about Kadon. He said it carefully, with the care he used for things that were not his to handle carelessly. Not about Kadon dying, about Corvin catching him when he fell. He picked up a feather from the open box and turned it between 2 fingers, looking past her shoulder rather than at it. "And Corvin said something I couldn't hear the start of, and then I heard him say, 'I know you are not him. I have always known.' And Devon said," Elian's voice went quiet. He said, "I know. I'm sorry it took me 9 years to say that out loud." She sat with that. Devon apologizing for 9 years of not naming something, Corvin receiving it. What that cost each of them she could only estimate from the outside, the way she estimated the depth of a river by how fast it moved, rather than by looking down into it. She thought of the 4 wolves Corvin had carved and left, where Devon would find them without ever once explaining why. The boundary stone, the gable post, the window ledge, the 4th deposited in a single night's run. each one a sentence he hadn't been able to finish any other way. 9 years of that. 9 years of an apology delivered in wood because the words themselves had nowhere safe to land until last night, when they finally did. "Did they finish?" she said. "I don't know. I left." Elian put the feather back. "It felt like it should be finished." He looked at her. "Is it going to fix the Ran and Vael situation?" "I don't know." She was honest about the not knowing, the way Elian had taught her to be. By being that way himself so consistently, it had become the register of their conversations. "It won't fix the political question. That's separate from whatever Devon and Corvin resolved last night." She looked at the table. "But Corvin is not going to be a weapon someone else can pick up anymore. That changes the shape of the problem." Elian nodded slowly, processing. "Ran and Vael aren't actually dangerous," he said, "on their own. They do what Corvin does. They wait for the right moment. Without Corvin telling them it's the right moment, they don't know when to move." "Yes. So if Corvin is not doing that anymore, then the moment never comes." She picked up the pen. "Which leaves Fennec and Ocel on the Elder Council. Sable can manage Fennec." He said it with the confidence of someone who had been living inside pack politics for 2 years and paid close attention. "Fennec respects Sable. He'll argue with her, but he won't move without her." He tilted his head. "Ocel follows Fennec." She looked at him. "You've thought about this a great deal," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 years." He said it without apology. "Since I got here, the succession question has been, it's like background noise, you know? It's always there. Devon knows I know about it, and we don't talk about it." He paused. "We don't talk about a lot of things." "No." "He thinks I don't worry about it." "He hopes you don't." Elian looked at his hands, at the scarred forearm. "If the thinning stops, if you actually manage to stop it, does the succession question go away?" "It goes quiet," she said. "For a while. Long enough for the pack to settle into the new shape." She looked at him. "It does not go away. Devon will need to name a successor eventually, regardless of how long he lives. That conversation will happen. He'll name Caden's line. There is no Caden's line. Devon is Caden's line." She stopped. He was looking at her with the inventory expression. "If Devon has a child," Elian said, with the directness of a 12-year-old who does not have adult habits of obliquity, "the succession question is settled. The Halomir line continues. The argument that blood right is illegitimate loses the only leverage it had because the blood continues." He paused. "That is the long-term resolution. Everything else is management." She was quiet for a moment. "Elian? It's not me suggesting anything. I'm observing. I think about the political structure because it's what determines whether I'm safe, whether this is stable." He looked at the feather box. "I just want it to be stable." She got up and crossed to the shelf, where Corvin's 4 wolves stood in the order she'd learned without meaning to. Boundary stone, gable, window ledge, and last the one mid-stride, foreleg lifted, that had migrated from the boundary stone to her own house without either of them ever discussing how. She picked it up. The wood had gone warm and faintly worn where hands other than hers had held it before. Elian's probably, from some visit he'd never mentioned. He watched her do it and didn't ask why. He had his own version of the same habit. The feather box, the careful accounting of every bird that had passed near enough to leave something behind. Cataloging, both of them, in their own registers. Hers in wood and paper, his in feathers and in facts about which adults could be trusted to hold which door. That was the whole of it, she thought, turning the wolf until its lifted foreleg caught the gray light off the window. He had built himself a system for tracking who was safe to stand near. The same patient, exhausting discipline he brought to sorting a nest's lining down to 14 species by barb structure alone, and he had spent 2 years running the entire Elder Council through it without telling a soul, because telling someone required trusting they wouldn't use it against him, and trust was not a thing Elian handed out ahead of the evidence. He had told her. That was the evidence. "I hear you," she said. "Okay." He picked a feather from the box. "Also, there's a new bird on the south bank. I think it's a kingfisher, but I haven't confirmed it yet. Do you want to go look?" The shift was clean and complete, the way his shifts always were. From the thing that mattered most to the thing that could be looked at directly, without the weight of the other. "Yes," she said. Pause. Seraphine's second letter arrived on a Friday. Not through the young vampire, not Kale, who had carried the first one and wore his usefulness to Seraphine, the way a much younger man wears a borrowed coat, visibly, gratefully, aware of the fit. This time the letter came through Aldrich. She had seen him only once before, at the bridge, a pace behind Seraphine's shoulder with the same stillness Voss had worn on the other side, the flanking stillness of men whose entire function was to be present and unnecessary, a demonstration of resources rather than a use of them. In 20 years under Seraphine's roof, she had never once seen him run an errand. Coven elders did not carry letters. They sent someone who owed a debt not yet repaid, the way Seraphine had sent Kale, or they came themselves. Aldrich had come himself. He was not young the way Kyle was young, not centuries composed into stillness, but decades of a harder kind, the stillness of a man who had decided long ago exactly how much of himself the world was permitted to see and had never once revised the number down. He stood at the threshold the way a soldier stands at a post he did not choose and does not question. And when she opened the door, the look he gave the room behind her was brief, professional, and entirely without curiosity. He was not here to see how she lived. He was here to deliver a letter and be finished delivering it. He held it out. Not the cream stationery Kale had carried, but a single sealed leaf. Older paper, folded and refolded so many times in its life before this one that the creases had gone soft as cloth. He said nothing. She took it. He inclined his head, not a bow, nothing so warm as that, only the smallest acknowledgement that the exchange had occurred, and turned and was gone down the river path before she'd finished closing her hand around the paper, moving with the particular economy she had come to recognize over 3 weeks as a thing vampires did and wolves did differently. Not fast exactly, but complete, no motion spent that the moment did not strictly require. She stood in the doorway and broke the seal. First Blood. That is the name. The Pack's translation is Threshold Blood, which is accurate but incomplete. The older name, in the language the accounts were first written in, translates more precisely as the voice that both sides share. Not a power, not a gift. A memory that both bloodlines carry of the time before they were distinct. You carry it more fully than any being I have encountered in 400 years. What I kept from you that I should not have kept. Your mother was first blood before you. She did not survive the political consequences of what she was. I took you from the wolves because I believed. and I still believe that your chance of survival in the pack at that time was not sufficient. I was wrong to keep this from you. I was right that you were in danger. Both of these things are true, and I am able to hold them simultaneously now in a way I was not able to hold them when you were a child. What you can learn to do with what you are, I can show you if you are willing. There is a practice, described in the Coven's oldest records, for learning to call the resonance deliberately rather than waiting for duress to surface it. It requires patience, and it requires someone who has studied the accounts to guide the early work. I am not asking to come to you. I am asking whether you are willing to come to me, on your terms, at the time of your choosing, for this purpose only. I will not ask for anything else. She read it twice. Then she folded it and went inside and sat at the table and looked at the archived notes in Devon's hand, and the bird record, and the wolf on the shelf. Her mother had been first blood. Her mother had not survived. The words did not land the way she expected grief to land. Not sharp, not sudden, nothing she could point to and name. What she felt instead was closer to standing in a room she had walked through 1,000 times and finding, for the first time, a door set into the wall she had never noticed. It had always been there. She had simply never had a reason to look for it. She thought of one evening, years back, before she'd had words for most of what she felt. 9 or 10 years old, asking Seraphine, the way children ask things, sideways, testing, whether she had ever had a mother of her own, a real one, before Seraphine. Seraphine had been brushing out her hair at the time, unhurried, and answered without breaking the rhythm of the brush. Everyone has a mother, Mara. Not everyone needs to keep asking about her. It hadn't felt like a refusal. It had felt like the kind of answer adults gave when a question was simply the wrong shape for the moment. She understood now that it had been a door closing, gently, by someone who had spent 400 years learning exactly how much force a door required. That was the gift and the theft in the same gesture, the way Seraphine did most things. She had not stolen Mara out of possession, not entirely. She had stolen her out of a specific, documented fear, and then spent 20 years making certain the fear never showed itself as a scar. That did not make it the right choice. It also did not make it the wrong one, and Mara found she could hold both without letting go of either. She thought about the voice at the clearing, the resonance rising without her permission, stilling 2 factions of ancient beings who should not have been stillable. A language below language that everyone in that clearing had recognized at the bone level. That had been without control, under duress, surfacing from a place she could not find afterward. The thought of being able to call it deliberately, on her own terms, in her own time, without requiring extremity to trigger it, was not a small thought. It sat at the center of everything the archive notes described, the voice between voices, a thing she could learn to use rather than a thing that used her when it chose. She picked up the pen and found the first line harder than she expected. Every opening she tried sounded like a woman still writing to the person who had raised her, when what she needed now was someone who had spent 20 years burying her mother's death inside a silence generous enough to look, from the inside, like love. She crossed out 2 attempts and was starting a third when the light through the window began to change, the flat gray easing by degrees toward evening. Pause. Devon came that evening. She heard him on the path before she saw him. A different rhythm than usual. Unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness, more the walk of a man who has set something down he'd been carrying a long time and hasn't yet gotten used to the lightness. He knocked, the small courtesy he'd added weeks ago and never explained, and she said, "Come in." and he came in and looked at the room the way he always did, in order. Table, shelf, fire, the map on the north wall, and something in the set of his shoulders was different tonight. Not lighter, exactly. Settled. A man standing in a room without also standing guard over it. She almost asked him about Corvin first. She decided against it. Elian had given her the shape of it already, secondhand and imperfect, and pressing Devon for his own account felt like asking him to hand over something that belonged, for now, only to the two men who had said it to each other in the dark. If he wanted her to have more than the shape, he would give it to her. He crossed to the table instead and looked down at the half-finished reply, the archive notes beside it, and read the situation without asking about it, the way he read most things. The second letter? Yes. She set the pen down. Seraphine knew my mother. She was first blood before me. She watched his face. She didn't survive the political consequences. His face received it, the amber, steady. I'm sorry, he said. The two words were clean and without performance. I didn't know her. She kept her voice even. It's information. It changes the shape of other things. She looked at the half-written reply. She's offering to teach me. The practice for calling the resonance deliberately. The Coven's oldest records apparently describe it. What do you want to do? Go. She looked at him. Once, on my terms. I want to know what she knows, and I want to be able to do what I apparently can do without requiring a political crisis to trigger it. She held his gaze. Is that... Do you have a position on it? It's your decision. I know it's my decision. I'm asking if you have a position. He was quiet for a moment, the folding knife in his pocket, not turning it. Still. I have a concern, he said. Not about your going. About Seraphine and what the visit costs you. He looked at the letter. She's very good at knowing what people need and providing it in a form that creates obligation. She does not do it with malice. She does not always know she is doing it. He paused. Go. Learn what she knows. Come back. I will. I know. He said it with the certainty he reserved for things he was not uncertain about. I know you will. She looked at him. At the man who had stepped back at the water's edge and come back with bees and drawn her a map and carried archive papers across a forest and sat at her table while the light moved and not once asked for what he needed from her directly. The thinning, she said. The last 5 weeks. The wrist is better. He said it flatly. The discoloration is fading, slowly. He met her eyes. It is consistent with the accounts. She put both hands on the table. He put both hands on the table, a foot away from hers, and looked at them. The archive notes, she said. The third account, the disputed one. It described a different proximity. She kept her voice even. Not weeks of general vicinity. Contact. She looked at his hands. The elder annotating it disputed the interpretation. She thought the translator had conflated 2 different terms. She paused. I don't think she was right. He looked at her. I think the resonance is not ambient. She kept her eyes on his, steady. I think it's carried in the body, the way a sound is carried in the body of an instrument. And I think what the third account is describing is not proximity in the geographic sense. She stopped, let him finish the thought. He was very still. Mara. I'm not... She kept her voice steady. I'm not saying anything about what should happen. I'm saying what I think the account describes." She looked at the papers. "And I'm saying that I do not think it changes anything about where we are. We are where we are, and the thinning is slowing, and those are the facts." She looked up. "But I thought you should know what I think the third account actually says." He looked at her for a long time. The fire ticked once and settled. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the cold had come in behind it to fill the space it left. A hush that had started arriving most evenings now, an hour or two before full dark. On the far bank, a branch let go of the last of its ice with a small, brittle sound, and neither of them turned toward it. He reached across the table. He turned his hand open on the rough wood. She looked at it, at the careful hands that touched things with a deliberateness that said he had learned to be careful with his own strength, at the wrist where the paw was fading, slowly, by degrees. She put her hand in his. He closed his fingers, not hard, not claiming. The specific grip of someone holding something they're not trying to keep, just touching, just confirming it was there. "I want to say something plainly," he said after a while. "Someone I trust told me I owe you that, and I am tired of being the reason you have to translate me." She waited. "I have been in love with you since before I had a safe word for it." He said it with the same flat economy he brought to a mortar joint or a hive box, and it cost him something visible to keep his voice that level. "Since the bridge. Maybe before the bridge, if I'm honest about how many reasons I found to look at you that had nothing to do with the negotiation." His hand tightened slightly around hers. "I'm not telling you this to ask you for anything. I'm telling you because you deserve to hear it plainly at least once, however the rest of this goes." She looked at their joined hands on the table, at the wrist healing by degrees, at every quiet, unasked thing he had built and fixed and carried to her door for 5 weeks running. "That's the most words you've used on one subject since I've known you," she said. "I've been saving them." She stood. She didn't let go of his hand to do it, which meant he rose with her, and for a moment they were simply close, the table no longer between them, the fire throwing its low light across both their faces. "Say the rest of it," she said. "Or don't. I think I already know it." "I'd still rather show you." She was the one who closed the last of the distance in the end, not because he wouldn't have. She understood even as she did it, but because she had spent 5 weeks learning that with Devon, the final small motion was always the hardest one for him to make first, and she was done waiting for him to manage his way into being brave. He kissed her the way he did everything that mattered. Carefully, completely, like a man who had measured the cost and decided it was worth paying twice over. His free hand came up to her jaw, unhurried, and she felt the whole careful economy of him finally spend itself on something that wasn't a mortar joint or a hive box or a map, and he made a low sound against her mouth that was as close to unguarded as she had ever heard him. When they broke apart, his forehead came to rest against hers, and neither of them moved to close the last inch again, because neither of them needed to yet. "I have wanted to do that," he said, "since a boundary stone and a conversation about bees." "I know," she said. "I've been counting." They sat back down at the table in the house at the boundary while the winter dark pressed against the window and the river ran, and the thinning slowed its quiet work. Her chair pulled nearer his than it had been an hour before, and for a long while neither of them said anything else. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. She could see it in the window's reflection, pale against the dark water, dissolving where it hit the current, settling on the stones at the river's edge, on the east bank birches, on the roof of the bridge keeper's house where the new mortar held the beam to the old stone. Once, at the very edge of the reflection, something crossed the yard in the falling snow that might have been a fox and might have been nothing at all. There and gone before she could turn to look at it directly. And by the time she did, the snow had already smoothed over whatever had made the track, if anything had. She didn't mention it. There would be time for what wasn't explained. Tonight was for the parts of the ground that already were. It did not cover the ground so much as change it. The same ground, seen differently. She kept her hand in his.